That's what I got, you guys.
Morning, everybody. Morning, Bob. We'll start with introductions, but first, before we do that, let me tell you that the 10 to 2 is aspirational completely, or 10 to 12. We may not get out of here by then. We'll kind of gauge where we are. We don't want to inhibit discussion or anything like that, but if we get done, great. If not, we'll take a break for lunch and come back. But that was kind of an aspirational thing on there. I had several people who called and said, I'm not coming for a 2-hour meeting. And I said, well, I'm not sure we'll ever have a 2-hour meeting, but that we can try. Introductions. You want to start, Fred?
Fred Van Aaron's Genesis Outline. Keith Fulton, Wyoming DOT.
Robert Hamilton, Rocky Mountain Power.
Chris Wickman, Department of Ag.
John Espy, Carbon County Commissioner.
Doug Thompson, Rancher.
Brian Rutledge, Audubon.
Bob Budd, Wildlife Natural Resource Trust.
Beth Calloway with Governor Gordon's office.
Amanda Withroder, Game and Fish Department.
Paul Warwick, Jonah Energy.
Joe Scott, Oil and Gas Commission.
Craig Smith, Wyoming DEQ.
Kristen Lenhart, BLM.
Joan?
Joan McGraw, Medicine-Bow Conservation District.
Craig Shedd, Grouse Mountain Consultants.
Mara Abbott, Buffalo Bulletin.
Nicholas Graff, University of Wyoming Watches.
Janelle Gonzalez, BLM.
Wayne Cotton, Game and Fish.
Guy Reed, Game and Fish.
Richard Garrett, the Nature Conservancy.
Dan Highland, Wyoming Outdoor Council.
Renee Taylor, Taylor Environmental.
Martin Blakeslee on behalf of Air.
And Dagger Fish and Wildlife Service.
Kurt Fleischer, 2DOT Consulting.
Dennis Movement, the Wilderness Society.
Kimberly Gassa, Oil and Gas.
Esther Wagner, Petroleum Association of Wyoming.
Dave Alfie, Oxygen Petroleum.
Nick Owens, Noble Energy.
Nolan Mathis, Senator Grass's office.
Right.
Brian Jensen with NRCS.
Ollie?
Holly Kennedy, Wyoming Farm Bureau.
Okay, so the first order of business, actually, I want to do, Dave, all you locals having a hard time getting here.
Yeah, it just screws me up these meetings that aren't in Cheyenne, so, or, Laramie or someplace. They call it Thunder Basin Associations.
With Cheyenne.
Yeah. So we need to have an extended moment of silence. Come to my attention that Marvin Blakesley is retiring at the end of the year. And that will probably shorten these meetings quite a bit because we won't have a lot of public comment and argument and that sort of thing. But I'd like everybody to wish Marvin the best. It's been great to work with you, and we're glad to have you here. And you are welcome back anytime. I appreciate it. Thanks for all you've done. All right, density disturbance calculation tool funding. This is an issue that has kind of risen in scope over time. It started out something that was absorbed, and we've kind of got to a point where it probably people need to know what's going on and be aware of it. So, you want to introduce yourself, Badger?
Badger. Lyndon Bucher, American Colway.
So I'll have Beth walk through that.
Yeah, this has been an ongoing discussion we have had also separately in our separate big dog meetings, which is our group meetings with federal and state agencies, and I'll spare you the details because we've gotten quite a bit figured out here. But I know this came up at the last SGIT meeting in September. So DDCT historically has been funded through the governor's ESA funds. It's an account that the governor's office has jurisdiction over in the past, and it's primarily paid for the development and maintenance of DDCT, as well as some mix of additional partner funding. I think my understanding is our federal partners and some other folks have kicked in the past to cover some of the additional asks to just the basic operations and maintenance of DDCT. So those funds, so DDCT, as many of us know, is technically managed by the YGIS group over at UW through an agreement with Game and Fish, and this agreement has carried us through the years since its inception. And the funding for DDCT carried over between administrations, between the Meade administration over into this first part of Governor Gordon's administration. And it was brought to our attention this summer and early fall that the funding was coming to a conclusion and we needed to re-up it. So we've had some really great discussions with YGISC and Game and Fish about some of the asks and performance that YGISC has done to get us to where we want to be with DDCT. And you know, with the new administration, I'll just highlight that we have a couple of pots of funding that we're going to start shifting over to use to fund DDCT. ESA, the account, has long been an account to really focus on projects on the ground related to ESA related topics. So that account will be no longer funding the DDCT. The baseline scientific data account from the governor's office will now be funding DDCT. So there are a couple of limitations, however. We do have a biennium appropriation that will cover us for the next biennium for DDCT. We worked out the costs of getting that done with YGISC. Just for basic operations and maintenance, and assuming that all the work that has been committed to completing before is already complete. So this is, you know, just operations and maintenance moving into the next biennium. However, the overall needs for that come a little bit short for that account. So we've got, you know, the biennium, as I mentioned, covered, but the, oh, sorry. Joy Bannon.
Hi, Joy.
Hi, Joy.
Joy? Can you hear Joy?
I can.
Okay.
Great. So Joy, we're talking about the first agenda item about DDCT funding. And where I'm going with this is to fund the basic operations and maintenance needs of DDCT. The account will cover all but $63,000 for the biennium, the next biennium. So that concept was introduced to our Big Dog group. I think there's some flexibility that our partners at the table have expressed interest in being able to contribute toward to cover that gap. And you know, I think it's in everybody's interest here to understand. I mean, this is a really valuable tool, but it just doesn't materialize out of nowhere. We have to think long and hard about how to fund those projects. And this is all, of course, contingent that our legislative ask in the governor's budget for baseline scientific data for the account is fully funded as we had asked for. So I'm assuming it will, and we'll get that as of July 1st, 2020. Any questions?
Yeah. What's the overall cost of DDCT at this point? Did you say that in your speech?
It's, oh gosh, $225 a year. So, but that was with some adjustments. So over the whole biennium, it's $307,000 from the governor's baseline scientific data account plus 63. So.
Okay.
370. I can even know.
Thank you.
Other questions?
And is Nicholas here today?
Thanks.
There you go. I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done on getting us up to speed on how things work and educating us on all the behind the scenes work. And you know, I think we've got some good assurance that will be covered for the next biennium.
So there's a couple things I think we ought to add here so that everybody, in the interest of clarity. The state has always paid for this. And so it's not something that was thrown back on the applicant or anybody else. The state's borne that cost. With YGISC, there were other things that Game and Fish needed that may or may not have been sage grouse related. There were things that the governor's office needed that may or may not. And the lines got pretty damn blurry as to what the basic cost of performing the DDCT function was. And so Amanda, Angie, Nicholas, a whole bunch of people got together and said, all right, what does it cost to do this? And I think where Beth is trying to get everybody to understand here is it now is an item that is identified in the budget as opposed to just we'll take some out of the ESA account, some out of FNRPA, some out of here, we'll go and do a plea and BLM will give us some money. It is important enough that it needs to be out where people can see it and understand that there is a significant cost to providing that service. So I think that's what we wanted everybody to be aware of. I think there's a lot of people out there who thought that that just happened automatically and it didn't cost anybody any time or money, and that is not the case. So.
Well, some of us also thought we had significant partners in the cost of BLM. And is that no longer the case, or are they still contributing at some level to this account?
There is an ask out now for them to finish that year.
Yeah, and then that's the $63,000 gap I'm talking
But
about.
that's that it, or is this going to roll forward? Okay.
I think that part of the reason for that is that of all the things that we do that you've got to have some reliability that's going to happen, this is it. And so if you every year are trying to go to Dave Applegate or industry or whoever else and say, hey, we need 20,000 apiece, BLM, we need 50 from you, Forest Service, there's no reliability. And so to perform that vital function, the state had, I think collectively, those of us in state agencies have said that probably is a state responsibility. So that's.
Dave, are you good for any more?
Start with Paul.
Well, industry, here's the other part of it, is that there are one-offs that we ask from them. Remember when we did the Daniel Core Area analysis, and we've asked for that to be done on all of them. Those are things that we will go to industry and we will go to your organization and others and say, help pay for these.
Yep.
Because they're above and beyond the basic function. But the DDCT as a basic function has got to be set up to be paid for. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick? Since
I
you-
don't.
Well, if you don't, I'll let.
You asked the
If
question.
you don't, I'm gonna let Paul do
I'm
it.
Neighbor True representing PAW.
Richard.
Bob, Beth, I wonder what else is in the baseline scientific fund? So things are individually identified within that fund request from the governor, is that?
It's administered at the governor's discretion, but if you read the statutes, it's, you know, in the past it was used to fund the governor's water strategy. So an element to that was collecting background data and developing an understanding of what kind of water data we have throughout the state. So there's a wide array of different uses.
The first use for it was Prebbles.
Will those appear as line items to the legislature, to the appropriations committee, and will they be able to say, well, we don't like this or we don't like that?
I doubt it.
That's a good question. I mean, I don't think so, but I mean, I do know in my latest report on the account, so there's an annual report due to legislature, and in that report we have indicated that the funds are encumbered for these.
In the past, the way that those accounts have been handled is each one of those has kind of a broad purpose that, you know, the ESA account is to deal with ESA issues. The FNRPA account is to deal with a little wider variety of county planning, things like that. And then the baseline scientific data is for data that's important, like Beth said, whether it's the water plan or whatever it is. It's a block within the governor's budget, but it's not line itemed out as to this is what I'm going to do, because they are discretionary funds. But every year, the governor's office will give a report on this is what those funds were used for.
How many requests do we get for DDCT runs from project proponents per year?
I have to look back the number,
I
but
think it was 200 some in this last
yes,
report.
it's in the neighborhood of at least on average 2 or 3 a week, sometimes more, depending on what time of year. It's not an insignificant amount.
Do we know of those requests, how many projects actually go to
Construction.
application? For
We have, I keep track of if a project is submitted to YGIS, we either move it along or we pass it, mark it as either expired or withdrawn. That's pretty rare. that's probably maybe 10% at most. Most of the projects, if they're going through the trouble with the DDCT, they're serious about it. There are of course people that do a DDCT that never submit it in those projects. I don't really keep track of those. That's for the people to run their scenarios.
Well, I think you might know where I'm going here. And I'm not a big fan of it, but I also know budgets are short. Not unlike when we submit an application to DEQ, we submit a fee. And I wouldn't advocate anything extravagant or anything complicated to pay that fee either. But it seems like it could be justified.
I think that we talked about that, and obviously the first time it came up, somebody said, well, why don't we just charge for it? Well, and there are two lines of thought, Lyndon, that I would share with you, and there may be more as well. One is, the state imposed this requirement in order to protect us from the need to have to word listing, and it's to track and know what we're doing. It plays a bigger role than just the permit that the individuals or the company is asking for. And the second part is that there are people who really probably can't afford it. They don't know how to do it, that sort of thing. That was long ago. I think you all who've been on here will remember we had a true mom and pop gravel pit came in and said you got to do a DDCT, and they just lost it. I mean, and so it was kind of a service to everybody who's out there. Those are a couple of the things that were kicked around as far as, should there be a fee or should there not? The bigger one, though, is we don't have any authority to impose a fee. The CIGIT does. Right. So are you going to go to every permitting agency and try and build a fee structure in their rules, which I'm not sure they have the authority to do that? So it may be more complicated and more costly to charge a fee than it is to just pay the damn.
Well, yeah, and then you get the administration of the whole thing.
Correct.
It balloons. You're right.
So those are kind of the themes that surrounded whether or not a fee should be paid. But do you remember any others that when we talked about that, Amanda?
No, that's exactly what we talked about, what came up.
Okay, so it has been talked about then.
Other questions, thoughts on the DDCT process?
Bob, I was just going to mention that in addition to the stewardship piece of it, which is what we're talking about as far as the funding goes, for the minimal funding needed to keep the stewardship of the current program going, the other piece of it is the redevelopment of the DDCT application to update it to meet technology, essentially, and be more customer friendly and meet more needs and do more tracking. So there's sort of two pieces of it. So the base funding that Beth is talking about is just keeping the wheels turning on what we currently have and doesn't take into consideration money that we put forth to develop the tool into something better and more useful for the state and for operators.
And no surprise, I'm very much behind seeing we get to where we do this record keeping so we can show what we're doing. I mean, that to me is the principle on which this can be driven, is whether or not we actually record what we've done and show its impact. Because until then, we're exposed.
Yep. And those things that Amanda is talking about are kind of the one-offs where we would go to BLM, Forest Service, NRCS, and others and say, hey, can you guys help do this? So that is pulling in the leg. I think that was a good distinction. This is just maintaining the system.
And I think that if you ever need help from us on the committee in making that point, we're here to do that. I am anyway. I can't speak for the group.
We'll send you an invoice.
I'm sure.
Okay, anything else on DDCT? I'm going to throw a couple of topics in here before we get into the handbooks and stuff. One is, Kristen, let's talk a little bit about where you guys are relative to the 2015-2019, and you announced the scoping and stuff. Would you walk through BLM where you're headed with that?
So, well, right now, we're still taking a look at what the path forward is going to be. So our administration at the department is working hand in hand with our solicitors. There's still a lot of questions out there that we're trying to answer as our solicitors really delve into how we're going to be responding. So we're still waiting on the final word, what the path forward is going to look like on that front. So unfortunately, I don't have too much more that I can share outwardly until we really get that path set. But we are reverting back to the 2015 plan, so APDs are moving forward. All of our actions, we're moving forward, just reverting back to those plans. As many of you know, and we've had the discussions in the Big Dog, Wyoming is in a little bit of a more unique situation compared to other states because the plans didn't have as many differences as some of our states like Idaho, Utah. So we're in a little bit of a different boat there, but that's currently where we sit. We hope we'll get word on officially what our path forward is going to be here soon.
So one of the things that was contemplated, there are two areas that I think we had, the two areas we tried to, I think, spend the most time on in the 2019 amendment were waivers, modifications, and exceptions, and mitigation. And I think we're at a point now where it probably is going to be something that we ought to look at an instructional memorandum on both of those to clarify the intent, because the intent was never different between 15 and 19, but some have interpreted them to be different, and that's where we had the snag. Is that something that you're pursuing as well?
Yeah, our shop is taking a look. Right now we're operating, of course, speaking of mitigation, with our MOU with the state. So that's where we're going with it. That's currently what we're operating under. And we'll of course continue to work hand in hand with the state and how we pursue that with industry when it comes to compensatory mitigation. We are also just taking a look at different strategies, a little bit more like what you're talking about, but an actual process of what that looks like in addition to the MOU. Whether it's going to come out in an IM format or not, we're still trying to hash that out, but it is something that we're taking a look at least at the state level.
Okay. Any questions on, yeah, John?
The question that I'm getting from some of our constituents it's on the grazing side, but how is this going to affect maybe permit renewals and all that moving forward? That's one of the concerns. It's
right. Well, right now, and I can bring that question back if there's something I'm missing or more details, but we're reverting back to 2015 in all regards with permit renewals as well, and at least in our initial analysis comparing the two plans, we don't see it as being too much of an impact when it comes to grazing and permit renewals.
Well,
yeah.
So we have seen one permit renewal come through the Casper Field office on 2015.
Okay.
That has thresholds and responses and those things that were addressed in the 2019.
Okay.
And so another question to kind of pile onto that too is, so we're going to have how many permit renewals done under 2015 that will have requirements that aren't in 2019, and then if the 2019 does go forward, what happens to those also? So that's a question that we're going to have to address at some point, but we are starting to see a few permits with 2015
So a
that
couple have come through.
aren't quite, for 2019 would be.
Okay. Let me take that back then. You know, it hasn't risen to the state office level just yet, because we're just processing them like we would under 2015. But let me take a look at that, and then I can get something back to the SGIT if that's okay, Bob, on delving into a little bit more detail, just getting a handle on what folks are seeing out there, and then our path.
Yeah,
a lot of it's going to be the path forward too, on where we end up.
I think maybe that's a topic we ought to put on the agenda for an upcoming Big Dog, and bring the right people in, and maybe even have some folks, John or others, if they want to come, because we can create a real mess out there if you have, as Chris has described, that we don't need to have.
Right.
And it doesn't add anything to the permit renewal to go back to 15 and use a different standard than what we did in 19. We all agreed that 19 clarified and did the job adequately. So I think we want to avoid that. We need to talk through how best to do that, I think.
Yeah, and consistency, I totally get that across field offices, so, yeah, I think go back to my folks and we can have that.
Let's do a follow-up here in a week or so.
Sounds good.
Okay. Other thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I'd just like to make a point, I guess, that I want to commend you for one thing on the work you've been doing on this bill that's moving before the legislature through the Minerals Committee.
We'll get to that one.
Okay.
I got it.
But it affects this directly because it's giving us authority to cope with mitigation that other states don't have. And so I think it's really important for everyone to note that vacating of mitigation as a responsibility by BLM has thrown this situation into turmoil in several of the other states, which were utterly mitigation dependent. So if there's tense nature that we need to take on because of this, it's because of the move that this makes for the bird, in my opinion, towards a listing potential because of the elimination of those, or at least limitation of those efforts in other states. And that will affect Wyoming if it happens. The other thing I think we need to be ready to defend, in my estimation, is our definition of prioritization. Because we're saying we prioritize post-sale, in effect, and I think that that's a difficult posture to defend. So I would just suggest that's the other place we're gonna hear some heat around this, is our last sale was 90% in habitat and 48% in PHMA. That's hard to say that that's prioritizing outside of sage grouse habitat. So I just think that we need to register those points as we try to figure out where we're going and what we're achieving. And we're almost 100% of what we're selling is in habitat. So that's going to be a little tough in front of the court to say that's prioritization. And I think we need to be prepared in that position.
How many parcels did they not get to that were outside?
I have to go look.
I think they got some. Didn't they get to?
Yeah.
Did you guys get to all the parcels?
That's the issue,
Yeah.
is we don't have a backlog. So we process the nominations that come through.
So,
And that's where the prioritization gets confusing. Now, if there were a backlog, absolutely.
But see,
that would
that's just the kind of discussion we have to be ready to have. You know what I'm saying, Joe? Because prioritization in the minds of those writing this is very different than prioritization in the minds of the people in this, on this committee.
But at the time it was written, you had a 5-year backlog
That's right.
in those offices.
Exactly.
I hear you.
And I think that that's been cleared up. The other part is, I think let's, as a Wyoming group, remember, we prioritize management and the way development occurs, not leasing. Leasing is, the vast majority of leasing never leads to development. So there's no reason to throw all kinds of regulation on the lease.
You and
It's
I
on
have
the
had this
development.
discussion.
Yes,
I'm
we have.
saying
So,
there's a difference between us having discussion at this table
right.
and defending a position in a court. And I think we need to be thinking about how the position, if it's the correct position, is defended. That's my point.
Gotcha. Okay, other thought, yeah,
Yeah, I'm still on grazing.
I figured.
I'm trying to figure out what was being added on, and now it's there but shouldn't be added on. What?
Chris, you want
So on the 2015, it had thresholds and responses. 2019, we had it meets the standards. If it's meeting the standards, then management, there's no sage grouse specific, there could be no sage grouse specific conditions placed on it. It could be, you could not meet a sage grouse issue and still meet the thing, but it comes down to the causal factors. But on the 2015, we have thresholds or responses built in, desired conditions based on the tables that we had at the time that were moved into the wildlife side of the standards and guides. So we will have thresholds and responses. The ones that we have seen, we're all meeting standards. So that's the good part, but there will be a time that discussion or those issues will come up. So the first ones we've seen were meeting standards, so under the 2019, there wouldn't be an issue, just we're gonna continue as is. But under 2015, they could put conditions on the permit.
So let me try and come at this a different way, and you correct me if I'm wrong. When it got down to the real problematic part of the way 15 was done versus what we did in 19, it came from sage grouse up. It didn't come from land health down. It was just twisted backwards. So what we did in 19 is went back and said, okay, you go through your normal process, BLM, of land health assessment, and then your habitat assessment on the wildlife regulations, and then you have sage grouse as embedded within that, and you evaluate that permit. Is it meeting land health requirements? Is it meeting wildlife needs? Is it meeting sage grouse? And you go through each of those iterations. And each one of those, as Chris said, if you got the sage grouse and it's not, you can still condition the permit, even if it's meeting land health, but you've done that assessment. And the other one, you could condition the permit without even looking at where it fit into land health or mule deer or whatever else was in there. So it just put it in the right order, I think. Is that fair?
That's correct. So like the half and all those type of determinations.
They're still there.
Inform the land standards and guides. It just informs it. So it's just a part of it. So it's basically the grazing regs are all based on standards and guides and of healthy rangelands. And so sage grouse or any other resource in there is just a part of that assessment in the standards and guides. The other way around, sage grouse was kind of separated from the land health. It could be its own thing that could impact, 2015 could impact a grazing permit.
How is the half material working its way up to the national measurement? Because I'm hearing there's a breakdown in the.
There are two different metrics that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually more than two.
Yeah.
But the assessment that's being done by Interior at a broad 30,000 foot level cannot even begin to incorporate the half. It's really an aerial photo that says there's sagebrush, is there other stuff, you know, that's what it is. The half can inform that. So if you do that and you find an area that says, you know, this is not, in relation to the landscape it's in, this is not right, something is wrong, then you can zero back in with your range staff and go out and say, okay, what's going on here? That's where the half would then start to, but the half is based on the bird, the other assessment is based on the habitat.
Yeah, I understand the half and AIM and
Correct.
all these others.
They're not the same.
But tracking them to a final, it's sort of like the discussion we've had of reporting upwards here.
Talk to Kristen, this is BLM's.
Well, she's sitting here at the table, she can consider me talking to her, but I think it's really important. We're collecting data, but I can't find the venal or artery system that leads it back to where the reports are. You know, I talk to the folks that are collecting the data, and they don't know where to send it. So it's a little bit of the same game we're in of trying to figure out how we get our reporting done so we can show what we're doing. Well, I'll talk to Gordon about it too, you know, but I think we need to be aware when BLM is not getting the data up on a range-wide basis, it exposes us, and that's why I bring it up here. Like I said, I will talk it over with Gordon Taves, I have before, but I think it's important that we recognize we're going to do our share of reporting, but we need the federal reports to work too, because we need to know whether we're doing it right or we're doing it wrong. And without real reporting, we don't know. So that's my point.
Okay. More?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Now, rangeland health is driving this thing, not sage grouse. I'm trying to boil it down, give it all, rangeland health. When we did this grazing thing, rangeland health, this was when Buddy and I were kind of at cross purposes. Sage grouse, and this goes to what Brian's talking about. In rangeland health, sage grouse is a part of that, but it's not everything. That's why you can't get it out of there, because it's this minimal part of the whole rangeland health thing. And that's where the responses and all this stuff is coming from rangeland health assessment, not being driven by SGIT or our initiative or anything. That's why you can't get it out, because it's buried in all this other stuff. And unless there's a special effort by the federal agencies to get it out. I don't think you are.
Well, I think, and this, it's kind of funny that this is following Brian's discussion on prioritization of mineral development. It's really the same issue. And that is that if you take a broad look at rangeland health and you have an allotment that is not meeting those standards, it may or may not be meeting some of the characteristics in the half. But that allotment then would be prioritized as one that you're gonna go in and you're gonna put conditions on that permit. You're gonna look at what corrective action is there. The way that it was done under 2015, it was basically the Las Vegas system. It was completely random. If yours came up and we went out and happened to say, we think you're not meeting the sage grouse criteria, then you'd look at rangeland health. And to be ecologically correct, you gotta look at the health of the system first. And that's what the change between 15 and 19 did. It didn't take away the half. It didn't take away the need to manage for those attributes that sage grouse select for. It just put it in the correct context of the ecosystem.
But for the purposes of SGIT, it's really important that we have that data that is the sage grouse aspect of this. There's no question that we need overall rangeland health data. But for our purposes here, we need to be able to report on what we're doing for it about the bird.
Yeah, and that, I agree with you, Brian. The situation is, when you turn it around and put it in this broad context, it's really hard to bring out those little pieces
And that's
for
the
our
point.
purposes
That's
in this morass of information.
So that means we have to focus hard on seeing that we keep those aspects and that they're reported upwards. Because otherwise, this is what you and I talked about before. In the rancher's interests, it's really important that we have the data to support the work they're doing, just as it is to have important data work on what we're doing about oil and gas development or bentonite or whatever we pick.
Okay.
I think we can get to that. Anything else on that? So you've got a few things.
I do, I'm making notes.
Okay. All right. The second one that wasn't on the agenda that I think is timely, just at least to let people know, is that the Forest Service protest period is on their changes is next week. That'll happen in Salt Lake. There aren't a huge number of protests. They kind of hit a lot of different topics. And the state will have people there probably stabbing themselves repeatedly in the leg with an ice pick to stay awake. But we will be there mainly because we are an affected party. We're not a protester, but in order to answer questions about the changes that were made in the Wyoming version, the versions in Wyoming between 15 and 20, that we will be there. So do you have anything you want to add on that?
No, 3 days is long, but we'll make sure we're there. We're going to have state agencies represented there.
Any questions on that? Okay, let's move on to the sage grouse executive order and implementation.
So I think actually what we want to talk about here is the efforts under the additional ask of the governor and SGIT's interest in developing handbooks and manuals on behalf of certain complicated aspects of the EO. And I was not here for the last meeting, so I'm going to try to summarize what I think I know based on recapping the discussion there. And so, of course, if anybody catches anything that I'm missing, please feel free to jump in. So we have four appendices in the EO that are charged with this task of developing handbooks. The first one is Appendix A, which is the coordination and agency cooperation. Appendix C, which is the habitat appendix. Appendix E, which I'm forgetting how we call it. What is it? Permitting. Duh. I should know that one. And then Appendix H, which is data and reporting. I'm going to lead discussion on A, C, and H. I was the lead on, we created subgroups, as you all recall, for the appendices, and the charge with the leaders of those subgroups was to come up with their recommendations and present it to those subgroups about what they think the appendix manual or handbook might need to have in it. So I led that effort for Appendix A. Joe Budd led Appendix C. Joe Scott was Appendix E. And Angie Bruce was Appendix H. So I'll do all three except for E because Angie's not here and Joe's not here today. Appendix A, I think, is a little bit simpler than I initially had set out thinking. This is...
Let me interrupt
Oh, yeah.
a minute. So what I'd like the discussion today to focus on is about three things. The first one is, do we need a handbook or a manual? I want you to think about that as she goes through these. Because we tried to be very inclusive as to what you would expand upon and what you would not, relative to what is in the EO or the appendix. And clearly, we found there were some you really didn't need to. So the appendix itself is the handbook. There's not an issue. Boiled it down to these four at the last SGIT and said we think they need. But as we go through it today, if, for instance, we get into Appendix A and everybody says, you know, this can probably be done with a letter or a MOU or, you know, something like that as opposed to a handbook, let's not add work to our agenda if we don't need to. The second thing is, are there things we haven't thought about in our previous conversations or that the subgroups missed or things they put in that didn't need to be there as we go through this? So again, just kind of an open brainstorming. And then the third is timelines. If it isn't something that has to be done, let's not get our hair on fire over it. If it's something that, you know, the process one, again, using it as my talisman here, if we don't need to worry about that getting done until April, then let's not be trying to do the legislature and the handbook at the same time. And so those are the three things I'd like to have everybody think about and comment on as Beth goes through these. Okay?
Yeah, I might add too, Bob, I don't know if today would be the time to really hash out hard details in this discussion either. So I think we should also reserve the ability to, you know, regroup those groups and discuss some details further if needed.
And yes, you will all see them before they're finalized.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll back to the whole group. We'll make them available to all the people here that can take a look at them. The idea is to add clarity, and there's no reason to do that in a vacuum. So, yeah, go ahead.
So Appendix A would be that example of an appendix that I think SGIT discussed developing a handbook or manual for, and after further reflection, maybe it doesn't need to be that entailed. So I led this effort and really kind of broke down the concept into what about this appendix do we need further clarification for. SGIT at the last meeting talked about the need to understand the list of MOUs that we have out there. There are state and federal agency MOUs with sage grouse, for example, sage grouse for the planning, and that no longer applies, but for mitigation, for example, just getting that information out there, the counties and their MOUs, how those might work in relation to the other MOUs that are in place. So I think that's certainly something we can easily do. They are mentioned in the appendix, but if we want to just have a list, a running list that gets updated, it might be a good idea and easily can be accomplished. The other hang and chat is state agencies and the expectations for their coordination and cooperation. So I think this can be sufficiently clarified through a memorialization and a letter from the governor to state agencies clarifying their directives under the EO. So many state agencies are quite up to speed on how the EO works, especially the permitting agencies, but as we'll discuss over time, you know, we get varying levels of interaction with those agencies based on how much they do need to participate in the permitting process. So a draft letter could entail pointing the agencies to the directives in Appendix A, as well as a section that discusses the general core area protection strategy directives, which were in the body of the EO, which is State agencies must prioritize the maintenance and enhancement of greater sage-grouse habitats and populations inside core, that kind of thing. So wouldn't be a long letter, but enough to really encapsulate what the expectations are of state agencies and their interactions with federal partners as well as private entities and counties.
We did that with mitigation, that the letter that Beth is talking about, I think most of you will recall that Governor Meade wrote a letter to all of the state agencies and said, this is how we're going to do this. And then we, from that letter, created a memorandum of understanding or agreement between all of the agencies of the state. So every agency was signatory to that. And it said, this is what we're going to do, and here's the framework. That's the mechanism she's talking about with the letter.
Another aspect that we've discussed is a roadshow. This, to my understanding, I did before my time, but under the last EO under Governor Meade, we embarked on a collective effort to do a educational campaign around the EO and really provide that dialogue between people who are not at the table all the time, but who are affected by these policies. So I know our federal partners and us are in agreement that we can embark on a similar effort again this year. So possibly starting something during legislature and catching some stakeholder groups, important stakeholder groups while they're there in Cheyenne during session, and then holding a couple more meetings throughout the state and really trying to reach all corners. So that's the last aspect to it that we haven't fleshed out details for, but that'll probably.
Just so I understand, this would all be attached to the EO, so that if someone looks up the EO, they get that letter?
No.
Okay,
that's the whole point. The EO is what it is. There would be a separate set of standalone manuals, so that if you're looking at if you're Doug and you don't care about agency process, you want to know what the habitat piece is.
But if we're doing a letter instead of a manual is my question, because I understand the manuals you're going to see, but if we're going to resolve this with a letter, should a letter not be in some way attached to the EO, so there is no, well, I didn't know that part of it?
I mean, maybe we can think about how the EO is communicated, like on the Game and Fish website. We could have a separate section on there.
That's what I'm thinking is a link. So
supplemental information.
If you have a question, you know exactly where to go to get the answer. So it's not, you know what I'm talking about. And then you get the guy that's out there that's going, I was trying to do the right thing and I couldn't find all the right answers. I just want to see it really simplified so that you aren't walking around in the dark.
I think this is the frequently asked questions part of the site is what it is.
That's why I say connected. It doesn't have to be part of the EO, but it has to be really easy for people to walk through this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's the intent. Doug?
Yeah, a list of federal agreements, MOUs, state, county. The problem is not knowing them. The problem is they occasionally conflict with one another. And if you're a proponent and you see this nice list on a attachment, okay, now BLM is doing it this way, the state is doing it this way, and the county wants to do it a different way. I don't know how you resolve that. Just by telling them, yeah, these are what's out there. I guess I'm trying to see where we're the ultimate benefit at the end and how to get there. You see where I'm going?
I do, and I think what this part is, and Beth, you can jump in here, but I think this is really a transparency and clarity piece, Appendix A is, so that you do know they're there. And then it doesn't do any good to say there's an MOU between the governor and BLM and not have it there so somebody can read it.
Right.
I mean, you would access, each of those would be something you could access, not just a list, a reference that says there are 20 of these there. It would be, if you want to see the one with Fish and Wildlife, NRCS, State of Wyoming, here it is, and then you can see what it is, and probably a brief description of what it addresses.
And how long they're in place for, when they're up for renewal.
The issue of the ones that are in conflict, I guess my hope would be that if we find there are some that are just absolutely diametrically opposing each other, this process and this transparency should let that become identified. That could come back here, and that would be the appropriate place to try to address that.
Well, we kind of talked about it with the grazing.
Yeah.
The other thing is, for a proponent, that list would be informative. Should it maybe be in the permitting appendix as, because the coordination was really envisioned to be, state, federal, county, government agencies coordinating. But for the proponent, for that to be beneficial, it probably needs to be maybe in that. These are the things, these are the maze of MOUs you're gonna have to go through, would help inform that committee.
You're gonna address some of that?
Yes.
Yeah, so when we get to that appendix, let's
Okay.
hold that thought.
Yeah, I'm not against listing that stuff, it's just. it'd be
Make
nice
sure
to
that
have
you're
a perfect.
yeah, I think Joe's got,
Okay.
he'll be able to answer that. So. Okay. On the Appendix A, are there other questions, thoughts? Is it something you think is necessary, that we have a handbook, a manual, some sort of a user's guide? See general agreement that that's one that you want.
Stepped out, but
A.
our group was thinking that there needs to be some kind of a flow chart or some kind of help for the minerals and leasable. There was a lot of energy around it.
Okay.
Bob, I do like the idea of the roadshow very much.
Yeah, I think it's time to do it. With that.
I did too, and like you brought up, Paul. How, I mean, I would imagine you would let it be a great opportunity to leverage local working groups as well.
Mhm.
And I mean, I think that would give them a little bit of clout and let them participate.
Okay.
Question on that, so when you mentioned flow chart, I mean, are you envisioning, just how the various governments interact with each other?
Yeah.
Outside of what's already described in the appendix?
Yes. Yeah. Where to go.
He's really more into the permitting one when
Yeah.
we
Yeah,
get there
I'll drill down to
than
that
the
level.
agency
Think
on
about
that.
the
Yeah.
application.
Okay, that makes sense, thank you.
We were getting into the weeds, is that fair to say?
Yes. Yes.
We'll cover it at meeting.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else on that? All right. C.
C, so Joe Budd was the lead on this appendix, developing the appendix and then also on the handbook discussion. So I would love anybody else to chime in here once I summarize where I think you guys are on this. But I will preface the whole discussion with, Joe Budd joining the governor's office and no longer in his role in the capacity that he was before. This appendix group, just wrapping it up, will need a leadership, somebody to step forward and help shepherd it through. I'll certainly help as well, but just someone with some better familiarity with some of the technical aspects to it.
No problem, Chris.
We did. Thank you. So, this is a really important aspect to the EO. Appendix C, of course, is the habitat appendix. So there are 4 sections within the appendix that were suggested to be built out as the overarching topics for the handbook or manual. And these were really designed to address the details I'm going to talk about now were designed to address some of the common questions around habitat, as well as, in general, some of the comments that we received during the executive order comment period last spring as Governor Gordon was drafting the EO. So the first one has to do with DDCT habitat definitions. And this is, you can kind of think of this as a way to primarily capture the institutional knowledge of all the work that's gone into how we got to where we are here. And that's explaining what these main aspects are. And so the first one is explaining the project level habitat definitions and how they inform DDCT. like including a history of the methods that were used to get the original maps, or how canopy cover was measured. The next section is really something to flesh out what this means, what the definitions mean, and that includes discussion on suitability, or each suitable definition, like, for example, explaining how buffers work, the difference between reclamation, restoration, and determinations for wetlands and irrigated areas. The section will also need to discuss the meaning of transitional, and looking at like the Douglas core area examples. Fleshing out processes described under disturbed, what that means, like short versus long term, industrialized areas, what the differences are in northeast Wyoming. And then there's some additional discussion in there that the group has, but in that, basically what I just described is the core of what the suggestion to the DDCT habitat definition section of the handbook would sound like. I believe Joe distributed this to the group, so if anybody else in the group wants to add to that right now, I don't think there was further discussion that the group does need to kind of land on how much more, if there's anything else under this topic that needs to get questioned.
Well, we just felt very strongly that having a basic understanding of how the habitats worked, how they've been defined, the differentiation that we've had across, because there's always the discussion of one size fits all, which we know fits no one. And so that was really important in laying out how the habitats work and giving people, and I have to say it's done also with an eye to the potential of new players coming on the scene that have no clue what we've been up to for all these years. And so laying out that history was pretty critical. So.
Yeah, again, it's the institutional knowledge. I mean, I think you could do this for the entirety of the EO, but this is a very crucial section to make sure that gets captured.
And Beth, I think just, we had a Douglas Core Restoration Team meeting yesterday, and I think that transitional piece is still, I mean, we really haven't dealt with it very much, and it's still there, still very important, and just fleshing that out so that we don't lose pieces, and that kind of goes back to that institutional knowledge, that as people change and as things go, we just need to make sure that we keep consistent on that. And I think there's going to be stuff, I'll talk to you a little bit, Amanda, because you weren't able to make that call. And some of the stuff just to make sure that we get that, and make sure that when we do it, since this is kind of the first one, that we are able to not only prospectively look at what we've been or doing and what we've done, but also to, as we work through it, if there's things that in the process need to be memorialized for, this is how you kind of do this stuff. There were a lot of questions about, like, so how do we really actually do all of this? And and I think those are good things to be aware of as well.
The really important part on this one for the group to think about is that a lot of these revelations, if you will, are now 14 years old. And so we recognize the need, but the technology and the knowledge we have today is not what it was in '07 when, for instance, transitional was identified. And it may be that you need to tighten it down. It may need that you need to loosen it up, but it is an appropriate point to start looking at all of those and saying, okay, we use this to get to this point. Is it still the proper cornerstone, or do we need to think about this new information we have? And where that really, I think, comes into play is what I would call the radical change in our understanding of what's happening with invasive annual grasses now versus '07. And what that means for a site that's transitional and the management of that site if you're going to get it back to function. So,
and we've got, I mean, like you said, we've got 14 years worth of data, and particularly for Northeast Wyoming, we got a huge. Not to say at all that we know everything, but we know a lot more than what we did at the time that we put this together. So I think that we talked about that as well, is that there may be a need to look at it and say some of the stuff that we looked at in 2007 just doesn't make sense any longer.
Yeah.
Or we could do it, but we can do it so much better if we look at it this way. And I think that was kind of what, when Joe and I were talking about it, was kind of in that arena that we were saying, just to kind of flesh that out. So certainly we don't want to lose where we've been, but also we now know a whole lot more, as Bob was pointing out, with the invasive stuff than we did when we were putting this stuff in 2007.
It's still a balancing act around transitional that I think everybody needs to be aware of. We don't want to discourage transition, but we don't want to award supposed transition.
We don't want to transition down.
Right, so that's the biggest, as I see it, and I agree with you, it's the biggest balancing act we have in this deal. It's figuring out how do we reward actual transition if it's in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think this ties back to the conversation we had earlier with Chris and Doug here relative to getting things in the right order as it relates to the rangeland health and how that relates to, because you can have a transitional site that meets rangeland health but does nothing for sagebrush.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think all of that is, this is one of them that I'm going to throw the timeline on you and tell you, you don't have to do it fast, you have to do it well. And I wouldn't be surprised if this one took the bulk of the next year to get to where everybody's comfortable with it.
Based on our discussions yesterday, we took a 15-minute walk and went into, I think, an hour and a half. And that was just with the subgroup, or with the RT team. So I think that there's a lot of stuff there. There's a lot of really good stuff, but it needs to be looked at.
Okay. Anything else on that?
I was just thinking the same thing you were, but maybe you just try to do the basics and you don't try to solve the world all in the first year,
I think what we were looking at was more the try to keep out, so to speak, out of the weeds.
Yeah, keep the fundamentals.
But look at some of the framework pieces that may have shifted since 2007 as to where some of these things, where there may be problems and where there may be better ways to generate path forward.
Okay.
All right, so the next topic for Appendix C's manual is reclamation. That's another section in the appendix. And there are two main topics I'll highlight here. The first one is looking at discussion for what are appropriate grass and forb communities and what are the methods for looking at reclaiming sites. And then the second aspect to this would be discussion on thinking about the relationship between restoration or enhancement versus reclamation. I think that's a pretty hot topic. And then, Joe threw this out here, and we may want to discuss as a group, thinking about restoration enhancement versus reclamation and its relationship with restoration credits when we talk about mitigation.
And I'd throw one more in this one, and that is, ideally, I don't think we have a real disconnect between restoration, reclamation, and all that right now. I think people have a pretty clear picture of that. But what we don't have, or have never had a good conversation about, is where. If we have a limited amount of dollars, where are the places that we really would like to do that? Go in deep, do it right, not scatter a handful of dollars across the state and get nothing done. And that comes down to impacted core areas, areas where we have a lot of birds, areas versus areas where we only have a few. Those kind of things, I think, Dave, for that group to look at as a way to annually even talk about how you build the lift that we've all tried to been working on for the last 15 years, how you get that done. So I think that's a fair topic to throw back to that group.
And I think the discussion piece, perhaps in this group, is that all these things are all scale dependent.
Yes, they are.
So what is the scale that we want to really be focusing on? Is it statewide? Is it core-wide? Is it LEC-wide? And we talked, because you are going to end up at different places where, depending on where you enter into the discussion. And I don't have a real good feel for whether we need to be focused, on troublesome leks or troublesome cores or range-wide or statewide, actually, is all that we can impact.
Well, I think that's the conversation that I'm applying, is that you have that discussion and say.
And try to come up with a.
Or maybe even better, that there be some evaluation, because if you take the difference between the Douglas core area, the amount spent per acre in the Douglas core area, and the work that's been done in the Wyoming Range sublet area, there's millions of dollars have gone into sublet Wyoming Range, but your price per acre is considerably less, and the number of acres affected is magnified. Not that either one is wrong, but if you have limited dollars, and this is selfish from my board's perspective, you got limited dollars.
Where do you go?
Where do you go? And the tendency of humans is to say, I'll give you 20, and I'll give Beth 40, and I'll give Brian 40, and hope it all works out. Well, maybe we ought to give you 100, and wait and give him 100 another time. And that's I think where we need to be thinking. Where can we do the most with what we have?
I happen that we need to get to a sort of a merit scoring system, so that we're looking at each of those potentials and giving them a weight and a value, and coming up with a fairly objective method of evaluating, do we get lift in population, do we get, or are we assuring a population, what are we doing, and then go through the variables and give them a measured weight, because otherwise it really does become subjective really quickly.
The problem with that is that you can't compare the two I just described in between. So internally, you've got
I'm not
100 on
saying
each.
one though, I think there may be a way to do it within internal measures where you could come up with a way of scoring rather than, this one just looks like it would be better to me.
What?
Let me ask this question. Where have we seen the greatest success to date?
On habitat enhancement. You can answer that 5 or 6 different ways. As far as scope, I would say the work probably in sublet Lincoln County. As far as response, I'd have to say that we've got areas in the Thunder Basin that the response has been better and quicker than anywhere else. And that's highly soil dependent, highly moisture dependent, highly site condition dependent. I don't know others. What do you, those of you who've been involved, Dave, you've been, he left. Joe Scott, reclamation stuff. Is there a highlight?
I've never seen it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so again, you come back to scale. But I think that getting back to your question, Brian, that some of this stuff, so you may want to factor in, are we interested in things like genetic conductivity? Is that important? And I think that some of that might, maybe we could, and we haven't, I mean, on our discussions, we never really got into that topic of, could we create a framework that says these are what these values are?
Well, to Fred's point, that's begun by doing a diagnosis. So we look at it and we start to figure out what are the pieces that weigh in, and then, so I don't want to take up a lot of time here on that, but I think that that's one way of beginning the process, at least, is to do a diagnostic approach, see what the aspects we're looking for are across the range, not just in one site.
So let me, I just gave Pat a 2-second heads up that I'm going to ask her this.
Okay.
But I didn't tell her what I was going to ask her.
It's been great, I'll see you guys.
Yeah. You're looking at this across the entire range, the whole West. Are there areas that you have identified or your team has identified as bright spots, problem areas? Are there things that you've picked up on restoration work and those that you can single out and say, this is something that we think has potential, or kind of give us a global view of where we're trying to go here? Because I know you're struggling with the same thing at a regional level. So thoughts, Pat?
Bright spots are hard to find these days. I mean, I'll tell you right now, the biggest challenge we're dealing with is invasive fire.
Right.
Which is going to rapidly become a problem here in Wyoming if we're not proactive. However, dealing with the invasives, other than getting on top of them right away, I'm struck by what Dave said. It depends on what your definition of success is. If we can do prevention to prevent invasives from getting a foothold, if we can do some treatments which have not been very successful, to stop invasives now, that's what we're really focused our effort on. As far as restoration, habitat enhancement, I don't know if there's anything that just jumps right out of me. And quite honestly, I get my information from the states. None of the states tell me, so I should probably refer to Leslie, but I don't put her on the spot. But I mean, the states tell me where their successes are, but it all depends on what their objectives are. You know, we're trying to maintain some connectivity in Washington State. I think that's a lost cause.
Right.
But we're doing that through CRP. You know, we're trying to do Nevada's very different from Oregon in some respects. You know, so I don't have the answer.
Leslie, your turn.
Maybe you won't call on me.
I'll call on you.
So, I think Pat and Dave both mentioned just connectivity. Small, isolated populations are worrisome to me as a biologist, so more connectivity, better. We don't have specific areas that can point out.
Connectivity from a habitat perspective, islands to go from one to the other. When you think of connectivity, I assume you're not talking genetic, you're talking habitat connectivity, right?
Well, hopefully habitat
Leads to the other.
leads to-
Correct. That's. Do you have examples of successes, areas you think headway is being made in Wyoming?
You know, this might be not answering your question exactly, but I think the successes in Wyoming are we still have the majority of our sagebrush while other states have lost it and they're trying to get it back. So prevention, an ounce of prevention is worth £1 million a year. So it's not the answers you guys were looking for, but
Well, don't worry, we'll call on you later.
But I think that's an outstanding point. I think we need to look at the fact that we do have some major resources still in Wyoming. Because I'm now also working in the grasslands ecosystem. They're down to 4% across clear to the states of what's left. We are in such better shape that if we can work on maintaining that, that may be a place to focus.
It goes back to the basis of what we did with the core area. We said keep the strong places strong. So we can fight ourselves to death trying to save little, pools of population here and there, or we can keep the strong areas strong. And I think that needs to be in our measure.
But the nugget that came out of this discussion right there is that maybe that particular part of this manual is mislabeled or we're not thinking correctly. Because if we're talking restoration, reclamation, and we really need to be talking maintenance, that's not the same thing. And maybe we need to prioritize or triage this to where maintenance is the highest priority and the others. Because again, if you're talking in terms of limited dollars and limited resources, and you're out there busting your butt to reclaim or restore, and you're losing more on the other end because you didn't maintain, you're not gaining. And so.
So that's where we are for the association for Northeast.
For DCA.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, not for DCA as much, but DC, I mean, that came into the discussion, but that our priority for the association is maintain.
So Chris, that's something maybe as we move forward to
Yeah, I want to try to leave that be a little bit, but I will say, when we, for example, look at Gunnison's grouse right now, a lot of the areas where they're collapsing are still good sagebrush, but there's absolutely no forb cover at all. So is that maintenance or is that restoration? If you've lost the supporting understory, then putting that back to me is part of reclamation restoration and may well be a way to maintain core habitat.
Yeah, well, we're going to have 50 terms out here in a minute. That's
Yeah.
not a good
Well,
place
anyway,
to go. So.
but I think, to me, it just suggests that we've got to spend a little bit more time looking at this and maybe a little bit broader focus than just what we had been doing over the past couple of meetings we had.
I think that's right.
Yep. Question.
Yeah.
Speaking of maintaining habitat, which can be a lot more cost effective than trying to rebuild it, restore it after it's been damaged or whatever. Do we have counts on habitat loss? How many acres of sage grouse habitat are we losing versus how many are being restored to some degree of functionality? Are we in a
No, in Wyoming, we're actually not. If you look at what we're rolling up for the 2020 report, we actually are, we're not, it's hard to say you're in a gaining situation, but we're not in a losing. So there's been, yeah, yeah, and maybe a slight uptick. If you look at the work again, because it is outstanding, the stuff that consortium over in Sublet and Lincoln with their conservation districts, Forest Service, BLM, everybody working together, they've done hundreds of thousands of acres of range enhancement that has been positive. Now, do you have 16-inch sagebrush in it? No, but do you have sagebrush? Yes. Do you have bitterbrush? Yes. You know, your system went from non-functional to now functioning. So we're still at a net, I think, positive on our ledger, but it really is more a philosophic thing is what I was trying to get at, that we as people like to fix things and we like to create things, and sometimes we forget that you better maintain what you got. And I think getting the focus back maybe wouldn't hurt.
And that's why I'll say that we kind of came unglued a little bit when BLM offered leases in the Golden Triangle area that allowed for surface occupancy, right? I mean, with some of the most productive, healthy lakes in the state, et cetera. So that goes to me right to the question of are we going to maintain that habitat? Just kind of you roll the dice. Right, Bob? I mean, leases are not developable. When they are, they are. And, you know, it just happens. And were to happen there, I think we might regret that decision to lease those parcels.
Okay.
You know, we're talking about, a little bit, we're talking about measuring what we're doing and the success of our program.
Correct.
And it comes back to something that we've all struggled with is, yes, it's easy to measure what we've lost, but how do we measure what we are truly?
What we've kept. It's proving a negative, and we run into that a lot here. Yeah. Doug?
Yeah, back to our, I mean, do we need a handbook, time frame, and detail? This previous discussion kind of, we're almost, how do you create a handbook when all of these questions are floating around in midair with no priority? I mean, that was kind of how we entered this conversation, and it seemed like we pushed that handbook out there a long ways. Is that where do we have to have all of these done and defined to create a handbook? Because I think we do need one here, because I was on that subcommittee and we agreed, yes, there is a lot of things need to be defined. What are we talking about for the proponents? We have to inform them, tell them what we're looking for, why we're looking for it. But how far out can you?
Well, I think what we did, this conversation, at least to me, illuminated was the first part of that handbook. Everybody said, yeah, we can define that, we can do it. But this piece, it may not be a handbook. It may be something that says we need to create a subgroup that works on through and includes people like Pete Stahl and others and make sure that we're still working on it. The handbook is less important perhaps than the philosophical approach of what is it we want to do. And that's why I wanted to have these conversations, is that to just write a handbook and say, here's what reclamation is, here's what restoration is, here's what maintenance is, I could give a hoot about that. It's what are the needs, what should we be thinking about is more, I think, what we're getting to here. So I think you're spot on.
Yeah.
This probably isn't in the handbook, the first version.
Well, that's, we were talking about that when we did restoration and reclamation, kind of threw a big plate, something on the plate there that we need to ruminate on.
So I'm going to ask you and Dave Pellets to get your heads together. You're retired, you aren't doing anything. So, and it's a lot of snow up there, so you just have time to sit around and think.
Yeah, right.
But I think the two of you pull this off of the kind of the main item that Chris is going to work on, and the two of you get a group together, get Leslie and some other people, and try and come back at the next meeting and have a little longer discussion about this particular topic. Is that fair, guys?
And so just so I'm clear, this particular topic, meaning
the whole question of maintenance, restoration, reclamation, prioritization of that, areas where we want to do it, do we count correctly for it? Do we address things like Brian raised where, yeah, we got sagebrush, but we got no birds because we got nothing for them to eat? That whole component, I think, is really worth teasing out. I mean, it could be worth several meetings or several months of thought to get to some of that. But it would seem to me to be something we as a state should have an handle on.
Well, I think it's actually critical at this point that we prioritize which direction we're headed on this particular subject.
Yeah.
If we keep doing what we've been doing with adequate, in some cases more than adequate funding, for the shotgun approach, that's all good and well, but that's going away. That's going away from our partners, that's going away from state revenue. And if we're not able to start to prioritize where we really can make a difference and base that on evidence of what has worked the last 15 years, we're going to be in trouble. Focus is getting pulled away in migratory corridors and other issues. Funding's getting pulled away. It's going to be a challenge. I think this is a critical element.
Well, frankly, that's why I brought up the idea of doing some discussion of weighting these values so that we then can come to a conclusion. Because we've all got good intentions all over the place, but good intentions will take us into a hole.
Yeah,
So your group's now expanded to four members. You got Dawn and
Anybody
Brian.
that think I have good intentions,
All right, shall we move on?
I would just add, I mean, I think this is the beauty of the handbook process, because it's illuminating so many of these nuanced and complex topics that everybody as a whole has probably been asking questions about for a long time, but this is a chance for us to really start digging into those. So the next section under Appendix C is wildfire. There are 3 topics in here I'm going to highlight. The first one that was just proposed to be discussed is that transitional process, and what that looks like, and then essentially identifying what are those triggers. Then outlining the tech team process, and then lastly discussing the effects of accidental fire on project location and the process around that.
Anything on that? I think that one's pretty straightforward.
Last but not least is habitat treatments. I'm going to highlight 2 sections in there. So the first one, we'll be discussing in more detail the content that's highlighted in the appendix about core and connectivity areas. So this will look like further discussion on how to calculate the 5% canopy cover for treatments, data requirements for prescribed fire, the interactions of Northeast Wyoming, those conditions in fire. Of course, with a lot of this information leaning a lot on game and fish's vegetation treatment protocols. And then the other section in there is the other habitat treatments. So basically it's talking about, what are non-core priorities, what are other projects in core, such as invasives, how to address West Nile, and then discussion of, other habitat treatments and their relationship with de minimis practices. So, and then a very important concept of this will be, I think, related to what we've been talking about before, but relative to habitat treatments, discussing these treatments and their ability to provide lift or enhance habitat. So I think that'll be an ongoing theme throughout this manual.
Okay, again, I don't think this one's going to be done by February.
We'll talk timeline. I think we might have varying deadlines.
Okay. Joe Scott?
All right, so Appendix E, we've kind of talked around it a few times, and really what we came to is that people are interested in process. I think the EO does a really good job of laying out what stipulations apply to what areas and so on that are organized. Most of the questions revolved around, I want to do X, how do I go through the permitting process without shotgun calling everybody, trying to figure out who I'm supposed to go to first. So I guess we're still a little bit iterative about how best to present that. We're working with some of my folks on trying to get some flow chart like things where they make sense. And in other places, it may be more of a description of the process and there's inherently going to be some combination of it. But that's what we're trying to get to, is so that project proponents, particularly ones that are maybe new to the state, as we get new operators in and other people that may be not familiar with working in sage-grouse, that they have somewhere to go and get an indication of how the process is going to work and how it flows through each piece. And so I don't have anything too formal at this point, but that is the idea. And if there's any other goals, overarching goals that people would like to see accomplished, other than being able to clearly see directionality of process and some description about how those pieces gets done and who's responsible for what agency-wise as you work through it. That's what we're trying to get to. I think we can probably get that done by the next meeting.
Don't you, it almost seems to me that with this one, until you actually put it on paper and people can see it, you really can't do it.
It's going to be hard, but as long as everybody, I mean, the goal would be so that people can see the flow of the process and which agencies or which portions, what the order is and who's handling what in a more visual sense. If there's anything else that I'm missing conceptually from the group that people want to see, I'd love to hear it.
I think the big issue that I've heard through all this time is where dual permitting comes in. In other words, where, you know, if it's I got to go get a permit from the state engineer and that's it, nobody really has any issue. It's when they don't know that there's dual permitting by two state agencies or by a state and federal or a county and a state, that's when they get uptight about it. And I think that's the real key, is being able to say, okay, if this is the type of activity, you probably need a stormwater permit and you probably need an OGCC permit, and if it's on BLM land, you need a BLM permit. And that's where the people that I get blowback from, that's always the issue. I didn't know I had to go. They just had one. We've got a subdivision built in Cheyenne. The guy claims he didn't know he had to have a stormwater permit.
Well, they shouldn't be building subdivisions.
Yeah,
I agree.
So when I get somewhat, I mean, this is very sage-grouse focused, so I'm a little leery of getting into becoming a consultant, saying, if you want to build a subdivision, you got to have a stormwater permit, you got to have a Chapter 27 DEQ permit, and you got to have a public water supply figured out. I want to keep off of how many different agencies do you need to contact, and more, how do you work through. So permitting agency may be a little more broad in these descriptions, because I want to be careful of staying in our sage-grouse lane and not getting into.
No, I agree.
You know, if you're going to construct a road, well, you might need a county permit. You might need
I agree with that. On the other hand, I don't think we should expect the public to have to go hire a consultant to figure out what they have to do.
No, the public shouldn't. A project proponent should.
Well, I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that in this manual it would say, if you are building a road, you may need a permit from YDOT, the county, the BLM, and whatever. And if you're, so if you're putting in an oil field development, Paul, you've got road permits that aren't related necessarily to what you get for the pads. But each of those components, I think, to be able to it's just a buyer beware, caveat emptor thing that says, if you're contemplating this activity, you may need permits from these entities. Now you go look. We're going to tell you where, but But I think that's really what I'm hearing people say that they need or want, is something that gives them a heads up, exactly what Lyndon is saying, which is, what do I need to think about before I bail into it?
I have a question, Bob. In these appendices, after I went through them, even though I helped to write them, I can see where some simple formatting changes would make things a lot more clear. And I'm wondering, is that possible? Can we do that?
Yeah.
I think if we made some format changes, changed some headings and things like that, it would
Absolutely.
really take out some of this.
That's the beauty of the way that we redid this executive order, and that's particularly why we did it, was so that after you get it in place a little while, exactly what you're saying, you come back and say, I think it would work better to do this. That can be done easily now, as opposed to having to go back and reissue another executive order. So, yes, absolutely, and that's open to anybody here, that you find something that you can change 5 words and make it make sense. Let's change the 5 words. That's in everybody's interest.
Maybe not even changing the wording, just changing the way it's
Sure,
laid out
yeah.
in the flow.
Fair game, absolutely.
Bob, how do you see that playing out? Okay. Then you got an idea, what's he do with it? Does he
Bring it
come
back
to
here.
you, just bring it to the table and say, I would like to make this suggestion?
I'd work it back through, so if it was on the permitting one that Joe did, come in and say, I think this would strengthen that, and then bring it back to the table, and then it would go back. The governor has to approve it, but
Yeah.
Ultimately, you just work it back through the same process.
That process is in Appendix A.
Yeah.
There's one little paragraph on the first page.
We'll get you a manual.
How soon?
Probably next week on that one.
Now, there are some things that get a little bit more in depth that also I wasn't aware of in the way people are interpreting some of these things. And I just became aware of recently of a SOP from the DEQ and how they interpret what a proponent needs to do. And I don't think it's correct. When it comes to interpreting valid existing rights, for instance. And it hasn't been treated as such in the past. So I do think that needs to be looked at. And maybe we need to, I think, probably need to sit down with Kyle or Todd and say, well, this is what the executive order says. Here's what your SOP says. Where we've not seen eye to eye.
Yeah. And again, I think that's what this vehicle here is for, is to help resolve those kind of things. If you can't resolve them with the agency, then that's what's appropriate to bring here.
But please also include me, if that's the case.
Pardon me?
Please include me if that's the
Oh,
case.
yes, and I guess maybe I would ask that we have a work group or something that can get together with the DEQ or if oil and gas, if there's anything in oil and gas that I'm not aware of, because I don't know that process, but to sit down with Game and Fish, DEQ, and make sure that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, I think what Beth is saying is she needs to be included in that communication, so that the governor's office doesn't get caught blindsided by you negotiating with DEQ and then everybody coming in and saying, hey, and the governor saying, no, that isn't what I intended, so.
Right.
Okay.
Am I on the right track there, Fred? Most of this has come out of some conversations and historic experience that the petroleum industry has had.
They're such a pain.
Well, they're underground. What goes on down there?
It's really just cleanup and clarification. It's not, it's, as Lyndon said, in some cases with people closed, just reorder things just to make it easier to follow.
I think that snowman is just kind of a core area for Trona miners over there, isn't it?
The problem is everybody's looking at it now.
Yeah, I know.
Jeez.
All right, anything else, Joe?
I'm good.
I have something else to mention in that appendix, because that in E is where avoidance and minimization is brought up. And we developed, I don't know, a year ago, that chart that compares core and non-core and what avoidance means and what minimization means. I started digging into that chart to bring it up to speed with the 2019 EO because it was developed under the 2015 and it will require some tweaks here and there. And so I think that's something that we should probably also take a look at in the coming months to make sure that everybody agrees that it is up to speed with the 2019 EO, as I would see it as a supporting piece of this
Yeah.
appendix.
That's true, and I mean, it may not be one handbook as presented publicly on a website or
Right.
access. There's gonna be several pieces, because there's also, that's where a link to like the DDCT process that we've already developed is housed. We're gonna have a one-stop shop for people to promote understanding, and that will definitely be a piece of it.
Yeah, and I think, as usual, when you use a term, and you manual, handbook, whatever, one guy thinks it's the little one that comes when you buy it, put it together, baby crib, and the other guy thinks it's the book that comes with your Ford tractor. And they're all gonna be a little different by their own nature. So one of them may just be a link to other sites, and the other one may be, this is how you put the thing together, but they aren't gonna be the same.
It may be more of a breakdown of these questions, like, I want to do X, here's the information, want it Y.
Yeah, I don't want anybody to feel constrained. Build what works for the one that you're working with. Okay, and Amanda, let's try and put that one on the next agenda, that chart.
The chart?
Amanda, I think that chart probably gets right into that discussion of the decision tree that Joe was talking about.
Yeah.
Hand in hand, as far as leading a person to where they're at in their process and what they need to do.
I can tell you, for all the pain that chart caused a lot of people, it really did alleviate a whole lot of mystery, and it just basically addressed it. So I think that's important to keep. Okay, you got one more, Beth?
Appendix H, that's the data collection and reporting that Angie led as the team lead. So this is just I want to say it's the shortest appendix. It's 2 pages. And this is the new concept that we've all been thinking about for a long time that has finally been memorialized here. The appendix talks about the annual reporting requirements of state agencies to report permitting actions, conservation efforts, and population data by March 31st annually, as well as discussion of population monitoring data, conservation efforts, permitting data, what that looks like, and then analyses. So Angie has characterized this as a phased process, just because this is also something similar to our discussion earlier. We're starting to think through about how we can best address the directives in this appendix, as well as thinking forward about what we think we can do in the future. So part 1 is tackling reporting, and Joe Scott has graciously taken the helm on this permitting reporting subgroup, state agencies, to talk about how will state agencies meet the annual reporting requirement for that March 31st deadline. And I think there was considerable discussion at the last SGIT meeting about what is the goal of this reporting, and what do we want out of it? What do we want it to tell us? And I look at this as 2 aspects. The first one being, we've got information that we can report as state agencies that'll tell us information that may or may not actually capture what we need to know. And then the second half of that question is, if it doesn't meet those needs, what will it take to be able to start capturing that information? And that question that SGIT arrived at last time was, how do we measure actual disturbance in the footprint of permitting of projects through permitting actions? And this group met. Joe presented some of the aspects of what the permitting agencies can do now, and the focus right now is reporting activities that occur in core area. So it doesn't include winter concentration or connectivity or non-core. That'll have to be at a later time. So the state agencies are working together. I think we're now saddled with the question of permitting actions do show when a potential activity might happen, but they don't necessarily close the loop on what actually ended up happening. And jump in here if you want to help me with any of it. So the actual on the ground action, we have considerable discussion about, you know, is it within the purview of the agency to follow up and find out that information? What kind of resources would that take? Do they have the authority to do that? And I think right now the group is looking at potentially using DDCT as that mechanism to capture that information. So in places where the requirement on the project proponent, because they have to do DDCT anyway in core, to go back and supply that information. We don't have that, you know, database or that function in DDCT right now. We haven't talked anything about like what it would take to be able to build that out. It could be an additional cost.
And it may exist. I would say we're partway down the road. We need to start sharpening pencils and see what functionality exists and which parts of it don't. But it seems through the discussion that all the agencies sort of coalesced on the field of the DCT is a natural house because we put in the proposed disturbance. If we can put in as-built and require that from permittees, operators, et cetera, on an annual basis, then we have a one-stop shop where the data's already in a usable format, and that would make the most sense to us. And those agencies that don't really collect spatial information don't have to collect it. They just have to require that the permittee inputs as-built data in on an annual basis, and then it's ready to report. And that seemed to be met seemed to be doable for agencies to be able to get that into permits. And it's not a big, we don't think it's a huge ask, so operators can gap at me if it is, but.
No, I was just gonna ask Lyndon, Paul, Fred, we've wrestled with this thing for quite some time, and it's in the interest of industry to do it. So is there a barrier to getting it done? Is it just because it is an afterthought, nobody thinks to do it, or?
We're doing it already.
A lot of companies are.
Well, but not everybody is.
Yeah, I certainly can't speak for any other operators, but we already track every single acre of disturbance.
Right.
For us to be able to, which I do report annually anyway, what I'm authorized to disturb and what my actual disturbance is and what part of the reclamation process that disturbance is in.
Is that in your EIS?
Both of them, yeah. But it's above and beyond our 06 EIS for
Right.
GIDP.
It was in the amendment.
Yeah.
No, because I helped work on that.
Regardless, people are putting it into the DDCT as proposed disturbance.
Yeah.
So in a lot of cases, it's just going back and saying, well, this thing I said was proposed, we done did it.
Yeah.
Or we did a fraction of it, and I think that's the real big issue.
That is the issue.
You know, we have somebody take a look at NPL, 3,500 wells at X amount of acres per disturbance. The actual may never be, what's proposed may never, ever, ever be realized. And the more likely scenario is a fraction of that large percentage of disturbance.
Well, I think
Or the
that's
next
almost universally true in any EIS I've looked at, that the actual is considerably less than what's permitted.
That's right.
So, but we're not, and this is Brian's harped on this, we're not capturing reality. We're capturing fantasy, and that's not in our interest, and nor is it in the interest of a developing industry.
I think it's being captured, but it's not tied back to the initial application. I mean, you send annual reports into DEQ that very meticulously go through snapshot, what's the disturbance, what's the planned disturbance for the coming year, but that's not tied to
the DDCT.
I'm not the best one to because we've never submitted a DDCT, never had to, but to come back to a DDCT where you're tracking that in a.
Translating that information that you're recording to the permitting agency into a spatial format that we can then put in the DDCT and compare it to what was proposed, see, is it smaller, is it bigger, is it the same size? Figure out the discrepancies and know where we're standing.
Just don't seem like a natural fit. We're already spatial, we're already.
It only makes sense, and to get this rolled up is the only way we ever, I mean, even our biological math is off, because if we're supposing that this is how much disturbance took place when it isn't, and the bird response is this, then our math is totally wrong on the population response to disturbance. So getting these things in a place where we're looking at them and really doing diagnostics is the only time we get to understand what it is we're actually doing. Whether it be right or wrong, good enough or not good enough, we won't know until we have real numbers in the mix.
And the only other way to do it is high-res imagery.
Too expensive.
And that's
What
not
that doesn't account for is transition.
right.
At all.
It accounts for disturbance where you can see built. You know, that's what it. But this seemed to be a much better option.
Yeah.
Cost-wise.
Isn't part of the DDCT worksheet requirement to provide a contact to get as the footprint information from?
It's included in the worksheet as an ask for a contact, but providing the as-built is not a requirement.
Right.
So it's,
So-
I'll let
so
Nicholas
sort of-
speak to about how many as-bills he gets on an annual basis.
But I mean, do you go and request those from those people since we provide a contact so that you can get that
The idea would be
information?
the regulatory agency would make that request as a permit condition.
Yeah, and I think that's the only way you're gonna get it done.
Yeah, and it's.
Otherwise,
it
it's
makes no
just,
sense.
it's random. If Nicholas thinks of it one day and doesn't, and if the company responds or doesn't, it's gotta be in there.
And the nice thing, functionality wise for an agency, is they can requirement, when the person submits it, we think we can set it up so that the agency regulator gets an email, and so he knows, oh, it's done, check the box.
Yeah.
It's easy, that way it's easy to keep track of on a regular
Are
basis.
you able to
Okay.
require that, Craig? In the
I
annual
think
report.
we can require it in the annual reporting. As an upfront permit condition, I'd have to go back and get a better answer on that, but the statute's pretty clear on what the administrator can ask for in an annual report, and it's fairly broad.
You know, frankly, how do we keep track of our percent disturbance? If we have somebody out there submitting DDCTs and said, this is what I'm gonna do, and then they never do it, all they're really doing is trying to keep their competitor from getting in. That's not
We're
right
over
either.
counting is the whole point. Yeah.
So this is back to the phased approach of the whole handbook for this appendix. This is phase one of the reporting. So we're talking as state agencies to just report on what we can. Report on the parameters we know overlap the sage grouse issues that we can get into the report. And once that's ready as of March 31st, we'll know earlier than then. But once we have a good handle on that, I think that will illuminate some of the other areas that we may have gaps or opportunities to fill in. And the mechanism will probably be this DDCT reporting. So that's it. The second aspect to Appendix H is any additional topics on here, as I mentioned, will have to be informed by reporting. So Angie suggests that we get together once that report is done over time, over the next couple of months to illuminate if any other needs come out of that we think we can build into a handbook. And then the last section is data analyses. I'm sorry, I don't have a whole lot of context on this, but she wanted to emphasize that this is not the scorecard. I think there have been some questions that have come up about its relationship, but it's just important to recognize here that the data analyses in the appendix are not equivalent to what the scorecard's function is.
They are a subset of the scorecard.
Yeah, so there's a conservation efforts data one-pager as well that Game and Fish has put together. It's not ready yet, but I think we can probably share with SGIT once that's completed very soon, either this week or next week.
Yep, as opposed to the disturbance side of things, this appendix also talks about reporting on the good stuff that's being done, and that information gets put into the Wyoming Conservation Efforts Database. Again, it's batched and rolled up to the Fish and Wildlife Service Conservation Efforts Database. And the idea of the one-pager was to just provide more clarity on that application, which is an arm of one step, what I'll just call the DVCT rewrite, if you will, to provide more clarity for people on what is being put into that database, what the database is all about, and how to access it, pretty much.
Any other questions on those?
No, I just think that the first year of reporting is probably gonna be a dog's breakfast, but we're gonna have, we can work through it once we get it and then upgrade it, right? And, like Paul said, I mean, I'm doing things now that I applied for 12 years ago. We're finally getting the go-ahead and the money and everything else that's happening, so there's gonna be a timing function, and we never wanna do more than we have to, because that costs us money, so the more we can minimize, the better off we are. So I think there is good news there. We just have to, and we're, from a snowman perspective, we're all for reporting.
Right.
There's nobody that's resistant.
Okay. Let's, we're gonna, I think we'll just work through, I think we can be done by 1, but let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll come back and get these last 2 items. Back to it here. Leslie, you ready? Come up here and help me with this one. So the next item on the agenda is the Northeast Wyoming and Jackson Adaptive Management Response Update, and I'm going to ask Leslie to kick that off a little bit, and then if we need to, I can help fill in some blanks. So, okay.
Yeah, so Appendix I talks about the Adaptive Management Plan. It's a new appendix. And so working through it, there have been 2 soft triggers identified in the state, one in Northeast Wyoming and one in Jackson. We are still working on the calculations for how to calculate a hard trigger. We have some ideas on how to interpret that language, but we're working on hard trigger calculations. So the soft triggers, the local working groups in those 2 areas identify these triggers and had been working on these triggers for a while before the executive order was released. But since the executive order was released, we are now following the executive order where these triggers have been communicated to the statewide adaptive management working group, and the statewide adaptive management working group got together a list of technical team members based on recommendations together. And so Bob asked me to contact those technical team members and see if they were interested in serving on the technical teams, and I did, and sent the list back to Bob. So that's kind of where we're at. As far as I know, the technical teams have not met yet. That's where they're at.
Okay, and I don't think they've met. Virtually everyone who was asked agreed to do it. They were pretty well vetted lists. There were some bumpy spots in this because I think that people's interpretation, and I did send a letter to all of the local working groups and explained that just because it says technical team doesn't mean they have to be a technician. I had that a little bit from one local working group. They thought it was going to be all scientists, and that was never the intent. The intent of the technical team is to get a gut check on what the local working group, they're the ones who are saying, hey, there's a foul. If you want this as a review, you can look at it any way you want. But it shouldn't be the same people. And so there was a little bit of consternation, I guess. Leslie, is that a fair way to describe it? And I think we alleviated that by explaining the purpose is to get another look at the same thing from a different lens, and not people who are seated at the table and working on the local working group. As with any subgroup, it can go the direction of a handful of the participants in that subgroup, and then they can basically kind of form their own reality. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it never hurts every once in a while, as we do in here, to say, hey, give us a different perspective. Tell us if we're missing something. So those groups are going to analyze the circumstances in both of the 2 cases. And I think they'll come back with recommendations that may be, some of the recommendations may be actually not to the SGIT. They would be to Game and Fish, or to BLM, or to the county, or whomever. But anything that they come back with will come back to this group so that you know what's going on. Because it's a soft trigger, there are no hard timelines associated with it, as if it were a hard trigger. It's really a great test run, I think, in 2 very different landscapes of the whole adaptive management system. And doing it with a soft trigger gives us a chance to look at it and say, work some glitches out, understand better where we're at, and then maybe look at what the constraints are as far as what the group might recommend or not. Some of the things that were contemplated, at least in one of them, were pretty radical, and I don't know that there are things that would fly. But that's good. That's what you want. You want every possible thing out there to be discussed. So. Yeah.
Could you kind of thumbnail the appointment and composition of these? How were they, you said they aren't the local working group, they're an assembled group. How did that play out, kind of, since this is our maiden voyage on these things?
Yeah, they're both very different. Leslie's gonna have to help me remember who all.
I don't need no who, just.
No, I'll give you. The statewide group sat down and said, okay, so what is the issue that we're looking at here? And who would be best to advise that? One of the things I'll tell you that we did that did cause consternation until it was explained is there's a county commissioner on both of them. And the reason for that is that the counties were rightly concerned about hitting us off trigger. But as I told one of the members who called me, I said, if you think the county commissioners are not going to be involved in this, you're smoking crack. So you better have them in there so that they can hear the whole discussion, as opposed to just bringing it, throwing it out there in a tri-county area and saying, guess what, here's what we're going to do. And so there were commissioners on it. We made sure there were landowners. In one case, it was important to have oil and gas represented because they are a major user in the Northeast. Who else, Leslie? We had biologists.
Biologists for the one in Jackson, geneticists.
Yeah, the one in Jackson is real science heavy. There are several there, but we put the Park Service on it as a major landowner. So they're each tailored really to the question or the concern of the area. And that's what, a little more so perhaps than just a local working group that has kind of a uniform set of criteria to be on it. And we thought these were people who could go a little deeper, but would represent interests that may not be reflected.
Can you characterize the stats that made it a soft trigger?
So soft triggers are very subjective, and basically it's up to the local working group to decide, hey, to blow the whistle, say
We think we have
a problem.
And in the Jackson one, it was population decline. In the Northeast, it was loss of habitat due to fire.
And those were both working groups who were making noise prior to this decision, right? I mean, we were hearing from Northeast already because of their concern about.
Jackson was new.
Yeah, Jackson.
And then there was a third that was discussed, and that was the Southwest group. And they didn't feel that they needed to have a review. They said, we think we've got this handled, and so they didn't ask for it. And that's fine. If they don't ask, we're not going to force it. So there's three different extremes there, perhaps. Is that fair to say the one was habitat loss, the other one was population decline? And, it's what do you do about it is the question.
I was just curious as how they came to the recognition to seek a decision.
Seek a review.
The group, so in each case, information came to the local working groups pointing out each of these situations, and the local working group looked at it, and then they decided whether to seek a review or not. And I sent the third one on to the statewide group just to see what the local working group was saying about that third one, and it's up to the state group to review or not, but the local working group was not seeking a review.
And I think it would be folly of us to say, no, we're going to have a review if they don't feel like they need it. That's why they're there. So,
Well, what action in that third scenario with the Southwest working group, what action did they take?
They had a fire plan in place after it was a fire.
Okay.
And so they already had a reclamation restoration plan in place. They felt it was going to be effective. What else, Leslie?
The BLM field office came to the local working group meeting and presented all of the restoration and fire restoration
rehab
practices
stuff
that they were implementing, and basically all the ideas that the local working group had to restore that fire, the BLM was already doing, so they felt comfortable with the current status.
Bob, as a side note, at some point I think it's worth us discussing, perhaps the state discussing, a little more transparency in the local working groups.
We're just about to go there.
Okay, I'll wait.
Okay.
I do have a question real quick. One of the aspects in my mind is timeliness and kind of how, this being a new process, how this will respond adequately to some of the urgency of the questions. I mean, do you have a feel for how the groups or the recommendations might come out and how soon? Or has there been any assessment yet on like how quickly or how not so quickly some of these questions could get answered?
So that was a question from a lot of the technical team members I asked, what's the timeline? And I said, this is the very first time we've done it, and I can't give you a good answer.
I don't anticipate it taking a year. I don't anticipate it in 3 months. I think it's somewhere in between that. And again, it's a soft trigger. There is no, it's not a crisis. It's an evaluation. I think when Leslie and I talked, I said this is a perfect opportunity for us to see how it works and what we might need to do. So I would personally err on the side of leniency and tell them take your time and get us a good answer, and then we'll learn from that. We'll be able to do it faster probably in the future. But I'm going to guess late spring we'd probably hear back from both, don't you think?
I would hope so.
Yeah, the latest. And if not, probably then we'll prod them a little bit. But
I think the Jackson situation might behoove that Jackson group to maybe work on a faster time.
yeah, I agree. So a couple things about this. One is it puts Leslie in a delicate position, and no one's more aware of that than I am, other than her. And we need to be aware of that because Leslie is the eyes and ears for those local working groups, but she also, because of that, is kind of been put in a position of being the technical advisor to both the working group and the technical team. And I want people to be aware of that because there are going to be times when I think she's going to cry uncle and say, hey, you got me in a box. And when that happens, open the door and let her out of the box is the point I'm making. So that's another part of this experimental design that we need to think through. And I think when we get through it, we may come back with, segueing into your question, Paul, with some suggestions to the department as to how the local working groups function. And that conversation is just starting a little, it was brought to my attention in the last month, and Amanda can jump in here too, that some of the local working groups perhaps feel a little disenfranchised. Some of them feel as if they don't know how they fit in with the SGIT. And I'm working on a letter to them to explain how we think that should work, and that includes the transparency piece. But for those who aren't familiar with how this all came about, the local working groups were not created by the SGIT. The local working groups were done back in 1999, 2000 when we did the first sage grouse plan. So Renee Taylor was on that group. There, several people in here who were on that group. They are an animal of the Game and Fish Department, and so they answer to the department. The department is the one that is the conduit for funding for them. They facilitate those groups through Leslie. So they're a valuable resource to the SGIT, but they're not your resource. And so that is something that we're trying to look at as to how do you make that more seamless between the SGIT, the department, and then the local working groups. The second thing, that they've been in existence for 20 years now, or close to that. I think the department commission are starting to realize maybe we better take a look at, are they constituted the way we originally set them up? Have we paid attention to how they're doing their business, what they do? And then thirdly, what is the business we want them to do? And so I think maybe it would be appropriate of the SGIT to ask the chairs of local working groups to get together and maybe even present to the SGIT at a future meeting, the next one or the one after, as to where they see their role, how they see fitting in with this group, how this group fits in with them, how they relate to the adaptive management working group, all of those pieces. But rather than us dictate to them that, ask the department for that and to see if we could coordinate that. Does that make sense to everybody?
I want to reflect back to it, and I know there's a lot of people who weren't here then, but the local working groups really made the original core area plan work.
Oh yeah, they were.
Because they came back in, we did that totally based on geometrics. You know, it was the circle around a lek and the overlapping circles built out to the area that we know that birds generally use. The local working group took those geometrics and applied them on the landscape. So we actually changed the morphology of the map to include what the grouse really used rather than just a geometric space. So they've been an important part of this, and I think recognizing that from this group, it is really important that we have not worked without them. They were an integral part of making this work.
I think a little of this is the natural atrophy that occurs when, at that time, everybody had something to do. And I remember going to the Cody working group 3 different times to get the maps. And I went to all of them, we'd sit down and go through that. John, remember doing Rollins, we did it 2 or 3 times too, didn't we? And
I don't want to remember those.
Yeah, but there was a task there, and so there was a symbiotic relationship. Well, when the task went away, it kind of changed that dynamic. And I think that's what we're trying to get back and make sure that we have that. So, yeah, Doug.
In those 3 instances, what or who informed the local working group? Was it someone on that local working group? Well, the one like the BLM went to them. Who kind of says, I think we got a problem? Was it somebody on the local working group or somebody from outside?
So in the cases of each of the fires, it was the BLM that notified the local working group that there was a fire. In the case of Jackson, it was actually me just looking at elect data, saying, look at your elect data.
Okay.
And that's where I say Leslie's in a precarious place, because she can be both the referee and the arbiter at the same time, and that's, we need to recognize that. But it doesn't matter. It could be a citizen who says, I want you to look at it. It could be members of the working group. That's open.
Okay, I just wondered in these cases.
Yeah. So what I would propose is let me work. Amanda, do you have anything you want to add?
I was just gonna, the complexity it's manyfold, given what you described about the structure of the local working groups being under the Game and Fish Department, but now being intricately intertwined with an appendix in the EO that requires this, that kind of lays a foundation for a communication process between the local working groups and the SGIT on adaptive management and triggers. And so I think the technical teams in my mind are a piece of the EO and not a piece of the local working groups.
Correct.
And I think we want to take care to keep them separate, because I think what we had talked about before, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, what we're hoping to get is, like you said, another perspective that would be one in addition to the independent, the local working group perspective.
And so when it comes back to the SGIT, you may have 2 reports that are identical. They may come back and say exactly the same thing. I find that unlikely. I think what you're going to have is a report from a local working group that has some different points of view from the technical team, but they're all aimed at the same, I mean, the pencil's pointed at the same end. It's just, how they each think you get there. And that's the value of having it, is to be able to not get locked into a box where everything is made by one entity. And so, yeah, that's a really good distinction that Amanda made, which is that one of them is a creature of the SGIT, that's the technical team. The other is the department. And that's why they aren't the same people, too. Okay? So, with your permission, did you have something else? Oh, you're scratching your head.
No.
So did you want to make an agenda item, sorry to interrupt, for the next SGIT meeting perhaps? perhaps?
What I'd like to do is, I think everybody agrees we'd like to do something like that. What I'd like to do is, with your permission, I'll work with Amanda and Leslie and try and get that group together, have those chairs on a call or whatever, talk about what they think is important to talk about. I can present what I think the SGIT's end is, and then we'll just have a conversation at either the next one or April or May on that one. Okay? Everybody good with that? Yeah.
What position will this group be if, hypothetically, the local working group has a pretty much what they'd like to do, and the technical team is
Clear off?
I mean, no, where do we come in?
That's where you come in.
Oh, thank you.
That's where you've always come in, this group has. You know, how disparate notions have been before this group, that's why you're here, and that's why it's such a diverse group.
Well, this distinction of game and fish entity, you know, that's gonna play into that
Yeah.
dynamic significantly.
But it always has.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always been a part of what we've had to kind of wade through, so. But it is why you make it. Okay, you good on that? Bailey? So at the last SGIT meeting, you'll recall we had we thought we needed to do a 101 on a couple of things. One was mining, they weren't quite ready, we'll do that at the next one. The other was county permitting and implementation. That was John had asked me to have a conversation about that. So we asked Bailey Brennan to come in and talk about the county process, kind of where it fits into all this. Appreciate you coming in. It's all yours.
Great, thanks, Bob. We were asked we being myself and Commissioner Espy, to come in and talk to you about county planning and how some counties address the sage-grouse executive order. So I'm actually going to initially turn it over to Commissioner Espy to talk a little bit about not only how counties interact with sage-grouse conservation efforts, but also more broadly local governments, because we thought this would be a good opportunity to highlight some of those efforts as well.
Alrighty. Maybe I'm lucky I live in a neighborhood that we are active in it. We have some conservation districts that work with it, and the Weed and Pest District work with it. You know, not the only Teton Conservation District works with their state and federal partners. Complete the Greater Sage-Grouse surveys and Grand Teton National Park. This has helped restore pasture lands within that park. Carbon and Sweetwater Conservation Districts have been very active in juniper removal and that, especially on the fringes of those areas. And doing, along with that, some riparian restoration work down there in some of those areas. You know, and I'm sure there's a lot more conservation districts doing a lot more, but I guess trying to get it out there that this is out there and we are working on it. The Carbon County Weed and Pest has partnered with the Forest Service on and the BLM and the Game and Fish to do aerial spraying for cheatgrass in the last 2 years. So we're trying to figure out they're working, and that kind of helps. We have a weed and pest supervisor that came over from Fish and Wildlife at one point in his career, so he's really knowledgeable about that and really goes. As far as when it comes down to, you know, counties and our planning and zoning boards, you know, counties have the authority to regulate land use, and some counties consider greater sage-grouse habitat when permitting development is, and I'll kind of get into that a little bit later. Counties also work as cooperating agencies with our federal partners when a lot of these projects are coming up. And I'm going to kind of turn it back over to Bailey, and then I'll give some specific examples of what Carbon County is, our planning and zoning, and what the commissioners kind of help towards the end.
Thanks, John. So talking a little bit about what kind of authorities counties have to regulate land use development and activities within their jurisdictions. Counties, and this is going to be a reminder for many of you, and I also just want to add that I'm talking about this from a very procedural perspective and about what's on paper on the laws and regulations, and very aware that there are many of you in the room who are familiar with this process in practice and implementation. So defer to you all and interested in your thoughts on that. But on paper in the books, commissioners are authorized to regulate and restrict the location and use of buildings and structures, and the use, condition of use, or occupancy of lands for residence, recreation, agriculture, industry, commerce, public use, and other purposes in the unincorporated area of the county. And they are authorized to do this for the promotion of the public health, safety, morals, general welfare of the county. This is a broad authority that counties have, that have been delegated to counties by state statute. That said, each county addresses land use development within their borders differently. So we have 23 counties. It's pretty safe to say that we have 23 different ways of addressing development in the state of Wyoming. And that can be a really beautiful thing, because not all counties are the same, not all counties have the same kind of land use development and demands on the landscape. But saying that there are some similarities and common themes among all counties. Most counties address land use development on a broad scale through their comprehensive plans. These are documents that are lofty, they're aspirational, they're forward-looking, they're not necessarily binding or specific on what happens on the ground. And then you have zoning regulations, which are more specific, and they actually do provide binding restrictions on what you can and can't do as far as development goes on the landscape. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process for applying for a permit through the county, and then talk about some examples of how different counties in the state address greater sage-grouse habitat. There are, depending on the type of use and the activity, different types of permits that you have to apply for with the county. I'm going to talk mostly in the context of conditional use permits or special use permits. These are permits for activities that maybe are a little bit unusual, they're a little bit more higher impact, and then they require a more detailed process with the county. So initially, some counties require some kind of pre-application meeting with a developer and the planning staff or planning and zoning commission. After that pre-application meeting, a developer submits their application. Developers are often, especially in the context of, say, wind and solar, required to provide notice to nearby landowners and mineral owners in the area, and then to submit evidence that that notice was given to the county. They're also often required to provide a general notice in like a circulating newspaper. So once the application has been submitted, it usually goes before the Planning Commission initially. The Planning Commission considers the application and provides a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners. In a lot of counties, there's an opportunity for a public hearing or public meeting prior to the board actually making a decision on the permit application. And then once the public hearing has been held, the board will consider and either deny or grant the application. And then, of course, depending if the permit is denied, the applicant has the opportunity to appeal that decision, usually to the county level initially and then ultimately to district court. So that's kind of the application process, very simplified and briefly stated. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about how some counties address greater sage-grouse conservation within their borders. And I'm going to do so in the context of solar and wind development, because that really is how most counties, or instances in which counties in the state have taken measures to update their regulations to address greater sage-grouse. A lot of what I'm going to say today can be applicable to other activities. It's just counties haven't taken those steps. So the first example that I have, I have copies. These are all public public documents are all on county websites, and you're free to go take a look at them. The first example that I have is the Converse County wind energy siting regulations. And the Converse County addresses sage grouse habitat in a pretty limited way. It requires that for a wind project, a site plan be prepared and provided to the county, and that in that site plan, the applicant identify any designated greater sage grouse core population areas. And that is pretty much it as far as this document goes. There may be some other requirements. I'm looking at Dave, he's shaking his head. Great. So that is the extent to which Converse County addresses greater sage grouse in the context of wind energy regulations. And I've dog-eared some of the interesting pages and highlighted the language there. If you want to pass that way, pass this way. The next example that I have is in the context of Sweetwater County. The document that I have for you today is just section 17 from Sweetwater County zoning resolution, and it is just as applies to wind energy development. And Sweetwater County prohibits development of wind facilities in greater sage grouse core areas as defined by the executive order, or as that document has been amended. That's just for wind, and I will pass that around as well. When it comes to solar in Sweetwater County, there is no solar development in greater sage grouse core area, and Sweetwater County contemplates working with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department to look at mitigation measures that may be appropriate, and then including those mitigation measures in any kind of conditional use permit.
We're just updating that now.
Oh, great.
They're going through an update right now.
Okay, interested to see what the update looks like. And then the last example I have, and I'm just going to speak briefly to it because I don't want to steal John's thunder, is the Carbon County zoning resolution. And they actually, chapter 6 of their zoning resolution addresses commercial scale energy facilities, including both wind and solar. And they require consultation with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. And they also prohibit development within greater sage grouse core as defined by the executive order as amended. And they also this document also authorizes the Board of County Commissioners to require the incorporation of wildlife avoidance and mitigation recommendations submitted by the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. So this, as far as I have looked at zoning resolutions in the state, is probably the most comprehensive resolution that addresses greater sage grouse habitat. It's only in the context of solar and wind. I haven't, when you're talking about other uses, I haven't seen another example of another type of activity that is given this kind of attention. But counties have broad authority, and that's not to say they couldn't, in the context of transmission lines, residential development, large-scale industrial.
I thought carbon did restrict residential in core too.
I don't think, not that I've seen.
No, it's kind of, you got to get to restrict residential in core. We got 2 towns in core.
Yeah, I know, but I thought there was one that you denied a building permit because it exceeded the 5% in core. South of Saratoga.
Well, and the building permit wouldn't come up. I wouldn't see that as a commissioner.
Okay.
That would have been done at the zoning commission level. Most of the stuff that we see is done through the conditional use permit deal.
Okay.
And there's what can be permitted, then they don't have to come to the commissioners meeting that requires a CUP. Then we come to the commissioners, and then that's where we really have the authority to take the advice that was provided by the Game and Fish Department and put that as a condition or use that to deny the permit or really go, that's by not having broad authority within those different zoning blocks, then anything outside that is not a permitted use within, say, RAM, then they have to have a conditional use permit, and that goes through the Board of County Commissioners. But if it's a permitted use, then it's just done. It's pretty much an administrative deal done straight through the planning and zoning commission.
Okay.
And there, just because a zoning resolution doesn't specifically address greater sage-grouse, there may be other ways that a planning commission or board of county commissioners could deny a permit based on a broader limitation or permit condition. So it may say, the county can deny a permit based on the fact that the development affects wildlife habitat detrimentally, and that could include greater sage-grouse habitat. Maybe not specifically in the plan or the resolution itself. So other counties do address greater sage-grouse to varying degrees. Some don't address it at all. Not to say that they couldn't, they just haven't found the need, or that's not what is right for that county. So with that, we wanted to leave time for discussion. I know we're already a little bit over time, so I'll pass it over to John again to talk maybe a little bit more about how Carbon County's experience, and then also some ideas for discussion and where the city wants to go from here.
Well, I have a question
Yeah,
that's over
great.
at Archie before John starts. and
Yep,
that is,
questions are great.
what are the areas that you, the counties, identify as gaps? That would be where the state doesn't issue a permit, you don't issue a permit, or you issue a permit without recognizing the state core area policy. Where are those gaps? If there are any, and I think there probably are some, but where are they and which ones do you guys think are problematic?
I think that comes down to how well versed your planning and zoning staff are. As a rule, our planning and zoning staff sends to Game and Fish for recommendations almost on anything that's out there. They submit. Game and Fish is on their checklist. When that application comes in, it's submitted to Game and Fish just for comment. But if your planning and zoning isn't doing that, I think that's where you can get stuff that can fly underneath the radar rather quickly. That's a procedural thing. It's not required, but it's something that our planning and zoning does do. One of the things that I have is, fighting with one of our, the wind development that wants to go in and set a core in Carbon County. One of the things I disagreed with how the DTCT came out on that, where they want to route the power line instead of, and I think that's where we need to work, I think, and really be able to massage those things into making sure that we're citing disturbance on disturbance or as next to disturbance as we can, so that we're not running disturbance out through the middle of what was virgin territories. We need to have some of that flexibility. And one of the issues that brought that up is the coal mine just kicked the disturbance level clear out of the park, and so that they were looking to get it back below the 5% threshold instead of going, we're already here, let's run it right next to a highway and let's make sure it's here. That's where I think where local planning and the Game and Fish are going to have to be able to have those discussions and that flexibility. So kind of, while I'm on a roll, what I would really, I think, like from that would like, we talked like the flow chart, and one of the things that our commission does is submit evidence of consultation with the game and fish. Now it's, you know, with the BLM or any federal agencies that are going through, and that's really looked on. We have an active, lucky in Garden County, or maybe not, but we do have a real active planning and zoning commission that wants to see that stuff, and they're very good about, we as commissioners don't have to come up with conditions to put on it. It's usually, it comes out of our planning and zoning, what conditions should be put on these CUPs as they're moving forward, or that. And we as a commission just day before yesterday denied a wind farm permit due to they didn't follow the process. They don't have their cost recovery done with the BLM yet. And we're real, that's getting off in the weeds, but it's how far do you want to go, and how true do you want to stay to your processes within the county. You know, and we have to realize we are dealing in rural counties, so at the end of the day, the state is where we have to follow. We don't get to make up our own rules as we go along. We have to follow state statutes and those. I'm ready to stand for questions now.
I've got a comment to Bob's question about gaps. An observation, at least in my experience so far in this process, indicates there's variation among counties depending on what their directives are. So the new FNRPA funding for Natural Resource Plan updates is a huge opportunity for counties, if they don't have any guidance on sage grouse, to really build that in if they want to update their plans or create new ones that they don't have. I see that as a huge opportunity. So, I mean, I'm sure WCCA is thinking about this, but I would encourage you as you interact with counties on this to make sure that's on the radar as well, if there's any desire on there to get some consistency.
Talking to the choir here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting, but I think that as far as the county natural resource plans go, we've always thought of them as addressing management of public lands and resources. And while a conditional use permit in the county will extend to a wind and solar project on public lands, I think it may be, most of everything that I just handed out is in a land use and zoning resolution or regulation package, not a county natural resource plan. But it may be an opportunity for counties to think about how they want to see greater sage grouse habitat addressed in their counties. Yeah, no, I like that.
So I think, Bob, getting back to your question, one of the gaps that I see, because we face it in Commerce County, is we don't have countywide zoning.
Oh, I know.
So that, what we can do is, as you saw, a very minor, you should at least let people know that you're out there, but as far as restricting or any of the other things that could be done, we can't. So we have included some in the land use plan, but again, it's just, that's an overarching, I don't want to say it doesn't help when you're looking at can you or can you not develop here. It can give direction, but it can't preclude. And so it's been a challenge in some of these areas where we would say we really don't want that to happen, but we don't have any way to stop it. And so from that standpoint, Commerce County is the only way that we can get anything done is dependent on what goes on at the state level. And if there are state permits that would preclude development, then you have a way of getting back into that. So that to me is, I chair the P&Z in Commerce County, and that's been one of the things we've really struggled with, is how to narrow that a little bit. And what Beth pointed out was as best as we thought we could do within the ability we have to work. The decision space is very small.
And that's why in Carbon County we really went to go after solar, and then we had some people that were looking to come underneath the industrial siding threshold
Yeah.
for wind farms. So that's why we came in and stuck that language in.
Well, the two areas that I guess I would see as potential liabilities, and I'm calling it a liability from a habitat loss point of view in core, would be roads. And, you know, a road that county permits that doesn't get permitted by the state. And the second one is the whole sneak under the threshold of ISC. There's no permit required. I mean, oil and gas isn't going anywhere without 100 permits. Mining isn't going anywhere without 100 permits. So they're not a huge worry to me. But some of these other things that could pop up, there's no restriction. And solar being the one that I am most, I guess, concerned about today, because you could go in and put a solar farm on a section of private ground and there's not a permit required anywhere in parts of the state. Right?
Land use.
Yeah, land use permit would be required. A conditional use permit, like if you look at Sweetwater County or Carbon County, a conditional use permit would be required for development of a solar, utility scale solar facility on private land.
But you know, we've got a bill working for that as well. We want to make solar consistent with wind, so that large scale would require state industrial siting. And it's getting some traction.
Either way, even a large scale wind that requires ISC, you still have to get a conditional use permit.
What
from
do
the
you
county.
not have to get a conditional use permit for? Or do
Depends
they
on the
apply to
county.
everything?
Well, and that goes back to Converse County where they don't have zoning. And that I think is the back door or whatever that exists out there within the state. You take Carbon County that has zoning, you know, no large scale commercial activity is going to occur anywhere without the permitting process going into place and all the review that goes with that. You know, so you're not going to get the roads built if they can't go there. We've started the process where there is a consultation with the Wyoming Game and Fish Department and these agencies where we can work through these issues. But the counties that don't have comprehensive zoning throughout their whole deal, and good comprehensive land use plan that addresses all these different deals and the zoning regs that go with it. I think that's the big hole.
You want to do about the county commission?
I do. I don't want to leave this table with the idea that there's this big hole out there. There isn't. Where are core areas? They're on BLM ground. If you were a cooperating agency, like when we did the Land Area Resource Management Plan, my bottom line was you will honor the sage-grouse executive order, period. That's it. So you actually have done that. The only thing we don't do, because we don't have zoning in Fremont County, is regulate private property. And that's what's going on in Congress. You can't do that unless you do zoning. If you do zoning, it goes across the whole county. You can't do bits and pieces.
Right.
So I guess Fremont County's regulatory mechanism would be the BLM as influenced by counties as cooperating agents. So those things, they just don't go out there and do that without BLM. And BLM's good about informing us and Forest Service on any projects that could affect that.
So with the eastern third of the state, you can avoid the federal nexus in the eastern third of the state.
Yes.
You could come in, not build a road across federal, not do anything, come off a county road so you didn't have to get a YDOT access permit off a highway. You on the eastern third of the state, you can come in and do that. You take out the grasslands and you're private.
And we actually had a wind company that did that. That they were not notifying the state, they were not notifying the BLM, because on their map, even though they were totally surrounding it, they had cut that out of the project area and said, we don't need to notify anybody about anything. That one we had enough teeth to be able to get them to at least notify. We couldn't do anything more, but we could get them to notify. So
Through the industrial siting?
well, so all you do, you go under. Parse stuff out.
Let me ask this question. For wind and solar, are they required to have the same timing stipulations, seasonal stipulations, any of that oil and gas and other operators are? And are they also required in non-core, based on proximity to the LEC, to be providing credits, or buying credits, conservation credits?
The answer would be yes. I mean, if they have to get a permit.
A state
See where I'm
permit.
going with the
I
question.
do, and that's exactly why I asked the question I did.
They wouldn't have to if they got a county permit, correct?
Unless the county required it.
Unless the
And-
individual county requires
Unless
it.
the
And
county
whether or not a
adopted
county
the
could
PO.
require compensatory mitigation is
Board aspect.
debatable.
Yeah.
And in Congress, the answer is, if you can get away, if you can complete your project without requiring a permit, the state.
I think, let's not lose sight of what Doug said. I think that the potential for this is very low, but it is something I think people need to be aware of, because as different land uses come about, and solar is one of them. A section of solar is a whole hell of a lot of panels. And, you know, that, in some areas, that could happen.
Well, and the impact is so different. I ran some numbers based on the facility outside, Fred, right next door to you. That's a 700-acre facility. So 700 acres producing 80 megawatts of energy. You know what it costs? You know how many acres it costs me to do that? 14. To produce an equivalent amount of gas to produce 80 megawatts of electricity. And that's a discussion that we're not having in this state. And it certainly goes well beyond SGIT.
But I was going to say, I think we're not the ones that are going to run that.
You specifically.
Time to go.
We're out of time.
Before we go, if I can make a suggestion, I'm not gonna go into a whole lot about it, anybody wants to know more, ask me. But if you're not familiar with Sage West, we've discussed a bunch of things here today that should be reported on that system. That's a system we put together with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Intermountain West Joint Venture for reporting stories on the sagebrush ecosystem that positively or negatively affect, but without any advocacy even allowed. It is straight up reporting. And some of these things, like the work in your county, belong in a story to give other counties ideas as it goes forward. So if you're not familiar with it, it now has over 300 agency and institutional members that are exchanging news stories about sagebrush. Well, I'm saying let's use it. Let's see that the stories get out there. I think there are some pretty cool things happening around that we need to get out on the wire and get people using it. We're also now doing a newsletter for legislators. So if you have a legislator that you would like to be seeing select pieces of this, let us know. And again, it is without advocacy. It is straight up reporting.
Okay. Any other questions for John and Bailey? I think this is.
One comment.
Yes, Dan?
Yeah, thinking about I found this conversation really interesting. And thank you for bringing folks in to educate us on it. In terms of the gaps, one thought that I had that could be a gap would be, say, for example, somebody wanted to mow sagebrush on private land, for example. There would be no permit, not even a stormwater permit or something like that. And then related to that could be agricultural conversion.
Correct.
And I don't know if ag conversion would be required to have a stormwater permit or not, or would fall under a general permit maybe, but.
That's always been a gap. Fortunately, our soils and conditions, it's not the risk that it was in Montana. That was one of the number one risks. But yeah, it always has been a gap.
But as being a rancher, black water and rainfall in Wyoming, what has been converted is pretty much the max that would be.
It's more than should have been.
Yeah, it's all, you know.
Okay.
Bob,
Yes.
just real quick, historically, can you talk a little bit about what county outreach has looked like as far as executive order has gone? I'm just trying to think of like specifically, so much variation between the way the counties handle it, and then you have some very proactive counties who have a great handle on it and have worked it into their rules, and then you have some other counties who maybe aren't as familiar with the executive order, its implications, or how it's being implemented. Is there any historical context to that, or is that something that we should be thinking about?
There is, and the historical context are those two right there. We added a county commissioner early on to the SGIT. They weren't originally, and I think that was the first addition we made, and they are here and have done, I know both Doug and John do a great job, reporting back at their meetings on what's going on with sage grouse, what's happening with the SGIT, what those are, and I think that is a way to update the counties. I've probably spoken at half a dozen of those county commissioner meetings about the sage grouse executive order, about what we do. But it's, as everyone in this room knows, the counties are their own set of government, and the state is a pretty hands-off approach to telling them what to do. And so the most you can do is coach.
We laugh at that.
I know you, and you guys are coddled like babies, and everybody else gets regulated. But aside from that, I think that's kind of been the philosophy, and so it's more an educational process. Is that fair with the counties than it's ever been to try and regulate?
Yeah, after Bob put me on, I made sure the County Commission Association heard about sage grouse a lot.
Yeah.
So,
And
But it's,
the regulation piece was not the road I meant to go down, it was more the education, opportunity,
Yes.
outreach piece.
Yeah.
Which is a nice segue into that road show we were
I was
talking
thinking
about.
And we actually did the road show for the county commissioners at one point. I can't
But
remember.
I wonder if the roadshow needs to go to the, I can't remember what the planners group is.
Yeah, it probably does, and that's what I think, Bailey, you helped illuminate that a little bit. The other issue that probably, and back to you, Beth, to the roadshow, I would guess that probably not more than a quarter of the commissioners today were on when we did the executive order.
I'd say that's high.
Even less than that, there's that much more turnover.
There's been a lot of.
There has in the last couple of years, that's true, so. Yeah, so it's a whole new audience that never was there at the genesis, and maybe an update. And Bailey, talk to Jeremiah and see if that's something maybe you guys want to do, have an update that you and John, I'd be happy to help, or get Amanda.
Hey, you want to see commissioners' eyes glass over, start talking about sage shit.
That said, it's on my list of things to do already. We have our legislative conference coming up, but the agenda's pretty full for that, so maybe next summer.
We could do it whenever.
Yeah, but that would be great.
So I'm
Do
gonna-
it the day before the cocktail party, and their eyes will glaze over some.
I'm just thinking out loud here, but I wonder if, when we're talking about this handbook and manual process, the county element, what you just described, Bailey, is so helpful to hear as a group. Could there be a part of, for example, the county permitting appendix, or part of the permitting appendix to include some discussion of what you just had, maybe just like a one-page process document on how counties and their permitting processes, how they interface with the EO?
Yeah, I think, what John and I have talked about is there a way to include in the EO some kind of template that if a county were interested in some sort of regulation or conditioning permitting on sage grouse, what would that language look like? Or a couple of different options, this is just like a blanket option, this is more specific, this is, and I think working with planners who have already incorporated that into their existing regulations would probably be the best way to go.
I think, let's see if we can follow up with the planners. I know you've got a really good one, see if maybe they'd be willing to pull this up, and then the next time they meet, we can visit with them. Okay? So I got one more quick item, and then we'll go to public comment. Actually, I have two. I think all of the counties should take a hard look at regulating turkey propagation. I understand that's quite profitable, and
Hey, Fremont County, do
and
whatever I want.
I know, that's why you moved. I can But congratulations, that was great. If you don't know, Bailey and her husband just moved to Lander and bought a small place and got in the turkey business, and every turkey was sold a week before Christmas, or before Thanksgiving, and that's why there's no leftovers for us today.
Yeah, sorry guys.
Good job.
But keep us in mind for next year.
Yeah. The mitigation piece, let's just take a minute. We had the Minerals Committee met in Casper a couple weeks ago. And they did a good job with this. They had a draft bill which was presented to them. They massaged that a bit, had an all-day meeting almost in Laramie. Beth was there, Amanda, myself, Brian was there, I'm trying to think who all, Bailey, yeah. And we went through that line by line, gave them some proposed amendments. They came back with an amended version, and they had it in Casper. And I had the opportunity to look at the other things they were proposing, none of which were adopted. So the bill is in, I think, 85% of where it should be. There are a couple of pieces in there that are still a little disturbing and not totally clear. The rules are where the thing will be done, and it's set up, I think, fairly well. The two that are still a little bit sketchy is the notion of a 5-year credit. What the bill now says is that they can't be less than 5 years, which opens the door to a different scenario. That, I think, is something that we'll continue to discuss. The other is the financial responsibility piece, and they built in a couple accounts that would be paid into that could do one of two things, and neither one of them probably good. Could underestimate the need for financial durability or overestimate. And so it could either keep people out of the business, or it could be so loose that you had a crisis you would not be able to deal with it. And so we're still working through that latter piece. I think the banks that I'm aware of would love it if the state held the fund, held their money in escrow, and then if something happened, the state would have access to it. That makes sense. But the way it's now written, they would have to do both. They'd have to have their own and then pay into one with the state. And that probably is prohibitive. So others, I know you guys, all of you guys were in Casper as well. Anything you want to add? Thoughts on that, on the mitigation legislation? For anybody here?
I want to add that that's the most humble representation of what you achieved during that work that I've ever heard. And I'm not very often complimentary of Bob, as all of you can agree. But he masterfully handled what devolved at one point into what I would reference, or my mother would have called, a bucket of guts. And he brought it back from that distance a long ways, and I have gotten calls from people who know a hell of a lot more about mitigation than I do and have been doing this for a long time, going, how the hell did you get a bill this good this far? So I really want to compliment Bob on his efforts on that behalf, and let's close ranks behind him when the session comes. And as you fix these few problems, walk this through, because it's a good piece of work.
Thank you.
I won't do that again.
I don't know what to do now. All right. Public comment. For those who have not commented or have something, Leslie.
I'd like to update Sigid on our meeting results, if I could.
Oh yeah, I thought you did that. I'm sorry. I should have had you do it. Go ahead.
Nope. So the department analyzed over 1,400 hunter harvested wings and came up with 1.1 chicks per hen as a fall recruitment rate. Last year we had 0.8 chicks per hen, so a little bit better recruitment this year. However, the point where the population is stable is 1.5 chicks per hen, so I am anticipating lower leg counts next year.
Okay. Bob? Yeah.
Was that pretty consistent throughout the state, or was there variables that were in regions?
Just looking through the regions, I would say the Bates Hole, Shirley Basin area was at the lower end of it, and the Wind River, Sweetwater was at the higher end.
Of course. Range between them?
Well, Bates Hole, Shirley Basin was 0.8 chicks per hen. Wind River, Sweetwater was 1.5 chicks per hen. And the rest of the areas where we analyzed wings
We're in between. It's, I guess, it isn't great news, but it's better news than we heard a year ago.
Considering the
Especially
late spring blizzards
yeah.
that covered the southern half of the state in this spring.
And the recruitment from the previous year was not great. So I did ask Leslie a question when we talked on the phone about these results, and that was if it is appropriate at some point to analyze those wing receipts in light of the fairly radical changes we've made in harvest and other things. Do we think we're still getting the representative sample that we used to get? And you said you were going to follow up on that, or you guys talked about that at the wing meeting, right?
We didn't specifically talk about that at the wing meeting, but I can talk to other states also to get much smaller samples
right.
than us on their wings. But I did bring up at least where we've been at for wing sample size since 1997 when we clarified our practices and average and the sample size. So we're a little bit below average, but I think it's to be expected. Kind of the downswing of the curve, but it's something we can definitely monitor. Yeah. Wing sample size.
Okay. The downswing is that from hunter effort or hunter success?
Typically, with sage grouse hunting, it's not a limited quota hunt. So as long as you can go buy an upland game permit, you can go hunt. So it's kind of like a general deer season. So the amount of animals in the environment typically dictate amount of hunter success. The less animals, the less successful.
I'm guessing, do you measure hunter effort?
We measure, yes, birds per day, or birds per hunter. Yes, we measure effort. So I can look at effort also.
Okay. Other public comment? Yeah.
Quick one, Tim. I'd like to just kind of endorse the recommendations that were made earlier about the importance of openness and transparency and making sure that policy documents, manuals, handbooks, interpretive letters, anything that interprets the meaning of the provision in the executive order be available to the public and when I say the public, I mean the entire public, business, academics, and everybody, so that we're all on the same page with our interpretations. And then the second is kind of a thinking out loud, it's kind of a question, but in terms of permit compliance and knowledge of permit requirements, I don't know the function and role of the Wyoming Business Council, but I see potentially that they could serve as a clearinghouse for permitting information for companies that want to come into the state, do business here, like one stop, instead of having to consult 15 phone calls in case they could get you on the right track, perhaps. Maybe they initiate that to the governor's office. Welcome to Wyoming, we want your business, here's what we require. Here's, and just make it easy for people to find out what permit requirements exist. That's in our interest as an environmental organization, certainly, and I think it would facilitate business, streamline it, reduce costs.
We kick that to Beth a little bit. I think that's more in line with what the new ombudsman position is than the business council. But I think the desire to have that is somewhat universal wherever it is. Am I right?
Yeah, and I think we can also just think broadly speaking about, this whole outreach effort and education, and making sure that throughout various points of interaction where the state will have, we can have information readily.
So we see a lot of issues there with oil and gas operators who have never worked in Wyoming, have no idea what sagebrush or sage grouse are. And not necessarily that, they just don't even know to look. Now, you can say maybe you should, but something to at least get them thinking, and it's a lot of it is on the contractor side of things, not the company, it's the contractors who are coming up. They maybe only be here for 6 weeks or whatever.
Okay, anybody else? Yes?
Why don't we get new signs at the highway that say, here's sage grouse, get a permit?
Keith will take care of that.
Traffic guys say we have enough signs.
I think we should have one at every state border. Do you have your sage grouse permit?
That could go really bad.
Oh, I was gonna.
Could go really bad. Yeah. All right, are there any serious comments? Thank you all for coming, appreciate it.
Bob, one question, so since we got tasked with this, are there people who would like to have this unformed philosophical, whatever it is, group that would like to be involved in that before we leave here and we have to put everybody on email? So, Brian, you said, other folks?
Paul and Doug.
Leslie?
So Dave, I think we're gonna be crossing.
I would, well, I mean,
You're a subset of his.
we're a subset of that group. Was that you wanted to be involved in this one too? Or?
Of course you do.
Sure. And I saw somebody's hand back there. Was that, Leslie, was that you?
We need somebody from minerals too.
I'll do it.
Paul's
What's the Badger trying to get from
Red or
the
the,
table?
I know Badger, you can't even find him, you know.
Yeah, I think he's sunk under the table. Paul said he.
Okay.
Well, that will at least get something started, and then I think I'll probably try to talk to
Yeah,
you
we'll
again
visit.
before we go.
Okay.
Bob, did
Yes.
I miss anything on permitting new mitigation banks as far as the bill goes?
As
Is that
far-
just on hold?
No, it's moving forward. That was the one I was just talking about. It's,
The permitting is on hold.
yeah, we're waiting for the legislature to clarify where they want it done. I think it's on, I've actually talked with State Lands and the Attorney General about starting the process of the rules just to have the basics, because it's the template. We've got the framework. So I think we may try to anticipate what might happen and even start that so that we can move it as fast as possible.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you all.